Chapter 1484. The fulcrum that Luo Fan was in charge of was a void in the starry sky. Watermark advertisement, test watermark advertisement test. This was the deepest part of the starry sky, and there was not a single star within a range of billions of miles. Even the starlight found it difficult to reach here, causing this place to be covered in darkness. Many cultivators in this world were unable to cast their gazes over here. For sages, it was naturally impossible for them to procrastinate. Since it had been decided, of course, they would immediately take action. After distributing the 20 fulcrum to the 20 of them, everyone began to move, either into the sky or into the ground, or into the sea, or directly at the border of this world. In the blink of an eye, they had already scattered to various places in this world. Luo Fan had also arrived at the fulcrum that he was in charge of, using the supreme authority that he had obtained in this world to observe this place. He very quickly discovered the specialness of this place. Here, it looked ordinary, but the nomological laws contained all the nomological laws in this world, forming a node of billions of nomological laws. Vaguely, the great Tao that this position was connected to was a certain key of that great Tao, and it was related to the entire great Tao. As long as it was slightly touched, it would have an extremely huge impact on the great Tao. This was the fulcrum. Luo Fan had the supreme authority, but the ones in charge of the other fulcrum were sages. He could rely on this supreme authority to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient, but the sages in the other positions could also rely on their own strength to be omnipotent. When he arrived here, the sages in the other positions were also in position at the same time. Looking at this fulcrum, Luo Fan instinctively knew how to shake this fulcrum, how to move this fulcrum. There was no need for the other sages to teach him the method. He raised his hand, and a spiritual light appeared in his hand. This spiritual light was extremely mysterious, condensed, and pure. It was as if it was real. As soon as it appeared, it also emitted a sense of eternity and indestructibility, the aura that belonged to a sage. This aura, because of Luo Fan's restriction, did not really spread out. It only enveloped the depths of the starry sky within a radius of billions of miles. After the spiritual light appeared, with a wave of his hand, the spiritual light abruptly invaded the void and completely connected with the fulcrum. The moment the connection was established, Luo Fan had a strange feeling. He seemed to have grasped the pulse of heaven and earth. As long as he willed it, a large portion of this world would collapse. Destruction. Even the laws of heaven and earth would become incomparably chaotic, as expected of the fulcrum. A saint is indeed a saint. Even if he's a false sage, his understanding of the essence of the world is not something that ordinary cultivators can compare with. Upon discovering this, Luo Fan could not help but feel emotional. This was the first time he had noticed this kind of fulcrum that existed in the world. This was also the first time he felt the importance of this fulcrum. In the past, he could look down on the great thousand worlds and even destroy countless great thousand worlds with a single move. However, he had never experienced the subtle details of these worlds so deeply. He did not know that there was such an important fulcrum in the world. This fulcrum was a certain key point that supported the entire world. Being connected to it, apart from the feeling of being able to control the life and death of a large portion of the world at any time, there was also the terrifying pressure that came from supporting the world. This pressure did not affect his body, but his mind, making him feel as if he was carrying an incomparably vast world. That feeling was really complicated and indescribable. At this moment, an inexplicable feeling came. In a trance, Luo Fan saw that the entire world, the endless world, had suddenly become illusory. Only during this time, the 20 points that were distributed throughout the entire world became more and more real and more obvious. In an instant, he knew that these were the 20 fulcrum of this world. Now that the world had become illusory and the 20 fulcrum had become real, it was clear that the other fulcrum were also in place and could be operated. Fellow Taoists, we need to condense this world first before we can move. Otherwise, this world will probably shake apart many small worlds during the process of moving. Before we reach our destination, we will be damaged first. The voice of the Genesis sage was heard by everyone. Regarding this, everyone had already expected it. Even Luo Fan already knew that there must be such a process first, so no one raised any objections. This world was about to move to another world to fight against another world. Even if it couldn't shatter the small world in the process of moving, it had to be condensed again to make this world more stable and powerful. Only then would it be easier for them to win the war. Otherwise, if this world maintained its original natural appearance, it would be as if it was going to fight with others without any defense. That would definitely be an act of suicide. In an instant, a message appeared from nothingness and was received by all the sages and Luo Fan. It was a method of condensing this world with the help of these 20 fulcrum. This method was extremely mysterious and contained the endless and profound Tao of the sages. Even Luo Fan could only understand this method and know how to use it by relying on the supreme authority granted by this world. If he didn't have this kind of supreme authority, even if this method was placed in front of Luo Fan, he would certainly be confused. He wouldn't know what was written on it, whether there were any traps hidden in it, whether there were any schemes. It might even take an unknown number of years of research before he could understand how to use it. However, this was naturally not the case now. With a thought, the various mysteries of this method flowed through Luo Fan's mind, allowing him to instantly understand everything. What an exquisite method. If I condense it like this, the appearance of this world will become a huge flying sword. At that time, the world itself will be an extremely powerful magic treasure. If I were to face a world that has not been condensed before, I would definitely be able to defeat it in one move. Luo Fan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration again. The more he interacted with the saints, the more he felt how profound their wisdom was. In terms of offensive power and defensive power, as long as one obtained the supreme authority of this world, even an ordinary cultivator would not be able to defeat them. He could barely guarantee that he had the ability to escape from a sage. For someone like Luo Fan, who had already understood the essence of cultivation and had experienced many holy wars, it was impossible for him to be a genius. With such a high level of authority, he could even be on par with sages in these aspects. However, apart from these kinds of fighting methods, the gap between ordinary cultivators and sages was so huge that it made people feel hopeless. For example, although cultivators with supreme authority had the potential to create all kinds of magical abilities and techniques with different effects, they had the ability to do so. However, only the sages were able to create the truly marvelous divine abilities and techniques. Only a sage could have this kind of wisdom and perfectly display this kind of potential, creating countless great divine abilities that ordinary cultivators couldn't even imagine. It was precisely because of this fact. Even though he felt that he could be on par with those sages, the methods that those sages used still amazed Luo Fan and made him feel that his horizons had been broadened. He felt admiration. The method to condense the entire world was extremely complicated and exquisite. Even with the help of the fulcrum of this world, it would still require an endless amount of energy to achieve. It also required the use of the Tao of the Sage on a large scale and the execution of trillions of false sage divine abilities to be completed. Such a requirement meant that this method could only be carried out by sages, other than Luo Fan, who wasn't a sage. The ones who controlled the other fulcrum were all sages. There was naturally no obstacle to their understanding of the Tao of the Sage. Since Luo Fan could understand that method so quickly, they naturally wouldn't have any problems. Very soon, everyone's thoughts flowed, and in the blink of an eye, they had already decided what they should do and what their respective missions were. Luo Fan was in charge of 1/20th of them, over 30 trillion false sage divine abilities. Each of these false sage divine abilities was extremely mysterious and complicated. However, each of them involved a certain aspect of the profundity of the Tao of the Sage. Although over 30 trillion divine abilities couldn't completely include the infinite Tao of the sage. However, it also included almost everything that Luo Fan could think of, as well as many aspects of the Tao of the sage. It could be said that mastering over 30 trillion false sage divine abilities would increase Luo Fan's strength, at least after obtaining the supreme authority, would be earth-shattering. Before this, the false sage divine abilities that Luo Fan had mastered were only those that he had encountered in the battle with the Monolith Saint's predecessor, Saint Yuan Bai, and the World Annihilation Saint. There were only a few of them. This restriction made it so that although Luo Fan had the power of the false sage divine ability, his own methods were rather simple, and his use of the power of the false sage divine ability was rather crude. Although this situation didn't affect Luo Fan's combat strength much, it made him seem to be lacking in methods when facing many situations, and he could only rely on some rough methods to solve them. As long as he could obtain over 30 trillion false sage divine abilities, this disadvantage would instantly disappear. Over 30 trillion was an extremely shocking number. With so many divine abilities, it was enough to cover all aspects. It could be said that there were millions of ways to deal with every situation. It could be said that Luo Fan's weakness of lacking saint-level methods had been instantly converted into an advantage of having plenty of methods. With so many false sage divine abilities, Luo Fan's strength would be greatly increased after he obtained the supreme authority of a certain world. Even if he lost this supreme authority, he would still be able to obtain endless benefits. Although after he lost this supreme authority, these false sage divine abilities would become profound existences that he couldn't comprehend or understand, and it would be even more impossible for him to use them. However, as long as he could comprehend any of the profundities contained in these pseudo-saint omniscient powers, it would be enough to bring him great benefits. It would be enough for his cultivation realm to be greatly improved, even. It would be enough for him to use his own methods to simulate these divine abilities, just like how the Monolith Saint simulated his own saint divine abilities back then, to achieve the effect of obtaining the power of these divine abilities. With the experience of controlling these false sage divine abilities, he used various other methods to simulate them. The power of these divine abilities. Even if they couldn't compare to the real false sage divine abilities, they were definitely 100 times better than normal situations. The effect was also 100 or 1,000 times stronger than simulating them out of thin air. Moreover, more importantly, these false sage divine abilities contained the wisdom of the false sage. This was the most important thing. The inspiration and wisdom that could perfectly unleash the power of a saint-level divine ability could be like guiding lights, guiding Luo Fan to control the abilities that he couldn't control as much as possible. Knowing the benefits that these 30 trillion false sage divine abilities would bring to him, Luo Fan suddenly felt extremely glad that he had agreed to help this world participate in the terrifying war that was about to start. Just these 30 trillion false sage divine abilities alone were enough to make up for the value of his incarnation. Although he sighed inwardly, Luo Fan didn't stop at all. With the help of the supreme authority given by this world, he slapped the 30 trillion false sage divine abilities towards this fulcrum. Then, through this fulcrum, they spread out to the boundless world, gradually causing the world and the boundless world to undergo some kind of extremely subtle change. At the same time, at the positions of the other 19 fulcrum, false sage divine abilities were also continuously slapped towards the fulcrum and then spread to the entire world. It was unknown how many major kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and minor kiliocosms were combined, gradually causing these worlds to change, and then the entire world to gradually change. Over 30 trillion false sage divine abilities. Even if each one only took an instant, the total time needed would definitely be long enough to make one feel despair. If they really carried out this kind of work according to the normal flow of time, then by the time they truly condensed this world might have already been destroyed by other worlds. Therefore, at this moment, the saints and Luo Fan all accelerated the flow of time in their bodies. They accelerated to a terrifying time flow that would make ordinary cultivators' hair stand on end. He slapped one divine ability after another onto the fulcrum, and they spread out into the world, constantly changing and condensing the world. Due to the terrifying flow of time, the evolution of the world, which should have taken tens of thousands of years to complete, was compressed into just a few days. Looking from the outside, the world that had given birth to a total of 19 saints gradually began to condense from its originally loose appearance. The countless major kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and minor kiliocosms that were originally like smoke began to gradually compress and condense. In the end, they completely attached to the surface of the world, as if there was an incomparably tough layer of defense covering the surface of the world. Countless dense layers of light exuded an aura of eternal indestructibility and indestructibility as they shrouded the defensive layer, causing the defensive layer's strength to increase almost endlessly. Faintly, it seemed to have risen to the level of a pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure. At the same time, the appearance of the world gradually changed. From its original appearance, it compressed into the appearance of a hiltless flying sword. The surface of the hiltless flying sword was covered by the defensive layer formed by the world and the divine abilities of the saints. From the outside, it no longer looked like a great world that could give birth to a saint. Instead, it had become a mysterious treasure that was condensed from a world. Just when the last layer of eternal and indestructible light covered the surface of the defensive layer of the world, the entire world slightly trembled. An indescribable spirituality was naturally born from the flying sword. This spirituality allowed the flying sword to fly freely in the void. In a flash, it even released a large expanse of sword light. In the void, it displayed an indescribably exquisite sword technique. It gave birth to countless worlds of sword light that spread out and enveloped the tens of millions of great kiliocosms. It made the living beings in those worlds feel the terror of the end of the world. Fortunately, the sword light did not erupt unconsciously. Although it had already enveloped the tens of millions of great kiliocosms, in the end, it did not erupt with its true power and completely destroy the great kiliocosms. Instead, after existing for a moment, it slightly swayed and disappeared without a trace. It was as if it had never appeared. In the void, only the unbelievably large formation appeared in the void and began to move towards a certain direction in the void. In this world at this moment, the fulcrum of the 20 worlds had completely changed their positions. The fulcrum that Luo Fan controlled had already reached the middle of the front of the long sword, in front of him. In other words, he was thinking about the direction of the tip of the flying sword. There was a fulcrum that was controlled by 3 saints in front. Behind him, there was a fulcrum that was controlled by 16 saints. Of course, these 20 points could not be arranged in a straight line. They were arranged in an extremely complicated and mysterious way to form a whole. In other words, a mysterious formation had become the true bearing point of the flying sword. If the flying sword were to be destroyed, it would first have to destroy them. Among these 20 fulcrum, the fulcrum that was closest to the tip of the sword was the fulcrum that Saint Jean Hui controlled. That fulcrum itself was attached to. It was not the sky, but the highest and largest in this world, the strongest mountain peak. This mountain peak itself seemed to have extended from the ground and pierced into the sky, as if it was a sharp sword that wanted to cut the sky open. Its status was similar to that of the Buzhou mountain in the primordial world. It was almost regarded as the key to supporting the world, although this world had undergone such an astonishing change in form in just a few days. However, for all living beings in this world, even for those pseudo-sage existences, they could only occasionally sense that this world seemed to be undergoing some special changes, but they could not really see what the changes were. They did not know that in just a few days, the world they were in had turned into a huge flying sword. Everything in the world looked the same as before. The earth was still the same, and the starry sky in the sky was still the same. Even the countless major kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and minor chiliocosms hidden in the world were still in their original positions. They could still be found and entered in the same way. However, apart from the fact that there was no change, there were also many things that had changed in this world. For example, due to the condensation and change of the world, the strange gravity and climate in this world had become increasingly strange. The astonishing changes in the environment in the mountain range, where the monolith saint used to be, had now become extremely common. It had almost become the norm in this world. This drastic change caused almost 20% of the living beings in this world to perish because they couldn't adapt to the sudden change of environment. This was because the living beings in this world were extremely adaptable due to the special nature of the world itself. Otherwise, at least 50% or even 60% of the living beings in this world would die a violent death due to the drastic change of environment. If it was more serious, it would not be an exaggeration to increase this number to 80% or 90%. Such a drastic change almost made the premonition of the end of the world, which had been slightly suppressed, become even more intense for all living beings. The entire world, which had calmed down a little, once again fell into chaos at this moment. Countless living beings who did not die in the drastic change in environment died in the slaughter of other living beings. The sages were also indifferent to such changes. They did not look at this world, and none of them made a move to change this fact. At this moment, all of them were doing their best to activate that fulcrum, allowing this part of the world to rapidly approach their target. Even though it had changed its form, the difficulty of activating the heaven and earth was not much lower than before. It still required 20 sages to work together to unleash the power of their abilities. Their target was a world with only 10 sages, or rather 10 pseudo-sages. Chapter 1485. Under the control of the 19 sages and Luo Fan, the flying sword formed by heaven and earth shot out at an unimaginably fast speed. Watermark advertisement test watermark advertisement test. After the vast thousand worlds were tossed into heaven and earth, they gradually disappeared behind heaven and earth. This flying sword was extremely agile when it flew. One could not tell that it was formed by heaven and earth at all. Instead, it looked like an extremely exquisite magical treasure that looked like a flying sword. In the void, time was meaningless. However, because of the nature of all living beings, they would naturally follow their own time dimension to calculate time. To the sages, more than 10 days had passed. That heaven and earth, with only 10 sages, appeared within their range of detection. The moment they discovered that heaven and earth, there was a mysterious wave that swept out from within. These waves contained an aura that they were extremely familiar with. It was an aura that only sages could have. As sages, although heaven and earth did not expect the appearance of this heaven and earth that was formed by a flying sword, the moment they felt this change, they already understood what was going on. In the blink of an eye, a strange layer of defense appeared outside heaven and earth. Following that, 10 enormous figures appeared on top of the defensive barrier. These 10 silhouettes were not real. They were merely illusory silhouettes. These figures were extremely huge. They looked like giants that were tens of thousands of feet tall. They floated above the layer of defense and looked up at the flying sword. Their expressions were calm and calm. Their eyes were filled with infinite wisdom and indifference. Even if one ignored the aura that they emitted, just from their appearance, one could tell that these figures were the sages of heaven and earth. Seeing the appearance of these figures, Luo Fan and the others all looked solemn. The appearance of these figures, it represented the war between two worlds. It had begun. There was no need for any words or arguments. They were all sages. Naturally, they knew what each other was thinking. However, there was no need for a low-level medium like words to let them understand each other's thoughts. It was even more impossible for them to use words to make the other party give up on resisting or invading. Therefore, this heaven and earth condensed flying sword suddenly froze in midair. Subsequently, with a slight tremble, billions of sword lights condensed into a world of sword lights that swallowed the world. This was a world of sword light. Even if it was executed by an ordinary longsword, it would be enough to destroy the world. Moreover, it was a long sword that was condensed from a world that could give birth to a sage at that moment. Moreover, the one who truly controlled these swords was the one who was eternally indestructible, impervious to all tribulations, and omniscient. The omniscient and omnipotent saint. In this way, it was easy to imagine how powerful the world of swordlight was. Immediately, that world was directly swallowed into it. Everything in the world of swordlight frantically rushed towards that part of the world and bombarded the layer of defense covering the world. To be more specific, there were countless extremely sharp swordlights, each of which could completely obliterate a supreme venerable that pounced towards the world. Each of them stuck to the defensive layer of the world and erupted with terrifying destructive power, causing the defensive layer to shake and the world to shake. At the same time, the countless creatures and cultivators in the world instantly knew what was happening to the world. An indescribably strong will to resist erupted from the hearts of all living beings. This will to resist was guided into the defensive layer. Gradually, the defensive layer gave birth to countless living beings that carried their will to fight. They clashed with the sword lights. At the same time, the power of the 10 sages in the world erupted. Their eternal, imperishable auras filled the world, causing the world to gradually change. The world that Luo Fan was in was able to make so many preparations to invade another world and even condense the world into a flying sword. This world clearly knew that the sages in its world were lacking and could not compare to other powerful worlds. So how could it not have made any preparations? In the end, under their power, this part of the world directly transformed into a human figure, which began to spread its legs, turn around, and ran. The human figure that was formed by the world did not have any features. In other words, its features were actually those of the 10 sages. However, although the human figure looked very agile and its movements were no different from a normal body of flesh and blood, its strength was only several hundred times stronger than before. Compared to Luo Fan and the others who had condensed the world into a flying sword, the power of this condensation was clearly inferior. This kind of condensing strength, compared to Luo Fan and the others who directly condensed the heaven and earth into a flying sword, was clearly millions and millions of miles away. Such a disparity made it so that it could only choose to escape as quickly as possible. It could not turn around and deal with the flying sword at all. It was so much so that even the world of sword light created by the flying sword could not withstand it. However, even if it turned around and fled, the resistance of this world did not decrease at all. The defensive layer on the surface was still as tough as before, and the many creatures that were condensed from the resistance of all living beings did not decrease at all. On the contrary, the number of creatures that were condensed from the resistance of all living beings did not decrease at all. On the contrary, they became more and more powerful. Seeing that the figure was about to escape, how could the Genesis sage and the others be willing to do so? In an instant, a sword light flashed, and the long sword went straight for the face of the figure, which was also the position where the 10 sages had condensed. Just as the long sword was about to touch the face of the figure swayed slightly and suddenly raised its hand. This move was so exquisite that even the most powerful venerables could only praise it, and they would not dare to say that they could perform it. The palm used an incredibly exquisite and subtle technique to place on the flying sword. With a slight tremble, the force of the longsword's thrust was dispersed. Even if the long sword continued to advance, it would not be able to stab into the head of the figure in the world. However, the flying sword was not just for show. With a slight tremble, it turned into a stream of light, changed from its original thrust to entanglement, and directly wrapped around the figure's neck. The entire process was so subtle and mysterious that it was indescribable. Vaguely, one could even see that between the wisps of light, there were worlds that were rapidly being born and destroyed. The figure faced the sword light. Without the slightest hesitation, he raised his hand slightly and blasted it at an undetectable, or perhaps even non-existent, gap in the flow of the sword light. There was a silent tremble. The long sword was blasted to the point that it could not continue to entangle the figure's neck, and the flying sword was revealed again. However, although the flying sword was repelled, it did not mean that it was at a disadvantage. On the contrary, the figure was at a disadvantage. This was because at this time, the figure's fist had already been pierced by a small hole. Of course, this small hole was based on the current scale of the flying sword and the figure. If it was based on a normal scale, that is, the scale of an ordinary person, this hole was unimaginably large. This breach was unimaginably large. Billions of light years of space and time were instantly blasted apart, forming an equally large area of destruction. Facing such a loss, the figure did not even look at it. He directly rushed forward and blasted at the flying sword again. This blast contained almost all the extreme means of combat skills. In the void, it formed a light screen, and the shadows of billions of worlds appeared within it. In the face of this explosion, the flying sword instantly reacted. As it trembled slightly, it similarly hid the limits of its combat techniques within it and fought with the figure. In the beginning, whether it was the flying sword or the figure, they could perfectly control their own moves and strength. During the battle, they restrained their strength and only targeted each other. They did not leak out and harm the countless vast thousand worlds in the surroundings. However, as time passed, as the battle became more and more intense, the moves of both sides were constantly broken up. Gradually, more and more power that was not controlled by either side leaked out. When a situation developed to this point, for the countless vast thousand worlds in the surroundings, a desperate disaster descended. One after another, vast thousand worlds were completely destroyed in the aftermath of the battle. Who knew how many trillions or trillions of living beings were destroyed in the process? The process of these worlds being destroyed was like fireworks being set off in the void, illuminating the originally empty place with a cruel beauty. In just a few days, the originally densely packed vast thousand worlds where the two worlds were fighting had almost been completely cleared out. Tens of thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of vast thousand worlds have been completely destroyed. Even the endless fragments of the worlds formed from their destruction were used by both sides to participate in this terrifying battle. In the end, they completely disappeared as if they had never existed, and the development of the battle was the same as it had developed in the beginning. At first glance, it seemed that they were in a stalemate. However, upon closer inspection, one would find that the flying sword was not damaged at all, but the figure was already covered with wounds. The situation seemed to be as bad as it could be. As their bodies were damaged, the living beings in the world felt more and more despair descend. Their will to resist began to be affected more and more. In the end, the number of living beings above the defensive layer that were resisting the world of sword light gradually decreased, and their power also began to gradually decrease. This result aggravated the damage suffered by the figure, and in turn, made the living beings feel even more despair. In this way, a vicious cycle was established. Finally, at a certain moment, the flying sword seized a flaw in the figure's defense and suddenly stabbed into the figure's heart, directly coming out of the figure's back. Such a drastic change seemed to instantly pull out all the bones of the figure, causing the figure to suddenly hang limply on the flying sword, no longer able to move. This was what was seen from outside the world. From the perspective of that world, the scene was so terrifying that it was beyond imagination. In an instant, in the boundless world, an area that was unknown how many trillions of light years suddenly collapsed. Then, it was replaced by a boundless heaven and earth that contained boundless spiritual light. At this moment, the Genesis saint suddenly said, "It's finally done." As he said this, Luo Fan clearly felt that the great Tao of this world suddenly shook. Suddenly, the great Tao of this world suddenly shook. Suddenly, it broke away from some kind of barrier in the unseen world and directly broke into another place. It entered another place in the unseen world. There was a fixed great Tao with a huge hole in it. The great Tao followed the hole and frantically poured into the great Tao. Gradually, it collided with the great Tao, gradually suppressing it, causing the great Tao to gradually fall into complete control. At this moment, 10 figures appeared in the unseen world, each of them looking calmly at the great Tao that had appeared and suppressed their great Tao of this world. Apart from the size of the 10 figures that appeared in the unseen world, the other 10 figures were almost identical. Apart from the 10 figures that appeared in the unseen world, they were almost exactly the same. Shockingly, they were the 10 saints of this world. There were men and women, old and young among the 10 saints, but they were all different. After appearing in the unseen world, they each made their move, summoning 10 primordial spiritual treasures that even the world could not bear, causing the entire world to shake subtly and violently, even causing the originally fixed great Tao to crack. After these 10 primordial spiritual treasures appeared, they directly blasted towards the great Tao that had just appeared. These 10 primordial spiritual treasures came in different shapes. There were seals, mirrors, cloths, swords, and other weapons. They all had different uses. All of them had different uses, but their offensive abilities were unbelievably powerful. In fact, they were several times more powerful than ordinary sages. These 10 primordial spiritual treasures simultaneously blasted towards the great Tao of this world where Luo Fan was. Before they even approached the great Tao, it naturally began to shake violently, faintly showing signs of collapsing. At this moment, 18 primordial spiritual treasures suddenly rushed out from the great Tao. In an instant, 3 of them firmly protected the 2 great Tao that had already been shaken by the impact of these primordial spiritual treasures, and even cracked and collapsed. Then, the remaining 15 primordial spiritual treasures directly met the 10 primordial spiritual treasures. The 25 primordial spiritual treasures came into contact with each other. In an instant, a terrifying fluctuation spread out. This fluctuation even broke through the barrier of time. Almost at the same time it appeared, it had already swept through the entire world, directly destroying the space and time, the rules and laws of this world, as well as all the cultivators, all the creatures, and all the tangible and intangible matter within it. In the end, even the fragments could not be preserved. They were completely destroyed by the fluctuation and disappeared without a trace. In an instant, the only thing left in this world was the originally unseen great Tao. Apart from this great Tao, everything else had been completely destroyed. This included the thousands or tens of thousands of supreme venerables, as well as hundreds of times more level 9 saints. However, throughout the entire process, not a single one of the 10 saints in the other world was moved by this. At this moment, they did not care about the changes in their surroundings at all. They used their primordial spiritual treasures to carry out an incomparably mysterious and incomparably tragic battle with the other 15 spiritual treasures. No matter how thoroughly the world was destroyed, as long as the great Tao was fine, everything else could be restored at any time. Even if all living beings died and everything in the world was destroyed, as long as they were willing, they could restore it in an instant. For these saints, the power of their divine abilities, their saint essence, and their saint positions would not be affected in the slightest. In this way, they naturally did not care about the life and death of that world. At this moment, the flying sword was completely undamaged. In other words, the world that Luo Fan was in was completely undamaged. It did not suffer any damage from the complete destruction of the opposite world. At most, it would only cause the world to tremble slightly because the great Tao was shaken. It really is tragic. At this moment, Luo Fan was quietly watching the battle between the 2 worlds from the fulcrum, looking at the hundreds of millions of relative changes occurring between the 25 primordial origin spirit treasures. At every moment, he thought to himself. Of course, that was just what he thought, in his heart. However, he did not have any psychological fluctuations about the destruction of so many living beings or the disappearance of such a vast and boundless world. It was not that he was born cruel. Instead, at his current level, any living being was nothing to him. He could create them with just a thought. He could create any world with a wave of his hand. In this way, any living being or any world was already insignificant to him. If he created it himself, he would still have some feelings and a sense of responsibility to protect them so that they would not be destroyed for no reason. However, how could he have any sense of responsibility for these worlds and living beings that had little to do with him? How could he have any psychological fluctuations for their demise? This kind of mentality might be unacceptable to ordinary people. However, it had naturally appeared and naturally occupied the core of Luo Fan's heart. This was naturally brought about by the improvement of his life level. It was not a change in his personality, nor was it because his heart had become numb. The result of the battle between the 15 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and the 10 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. It was destined from the very beginning. Although the number did not mean anything sometimes, a small number was not necessarily worse than a large number. But at that time, there was a considerable disparity in strength or a considerable disparity in the degree of tacit understanding between the two sides. Obviously, both sides were sages. They were omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient existences. Of course, this kind of disparity in strength could not be too great. As for the degree of tacit understanding between them, there was no need to mention it. How could there be any problems with the cooperation between so many sages who had been together for billions of years? Therefore, it was obvious that under this special relationship, the joint forces of the 15 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures were definitely stronger than the joint forces of the 10 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. In the end, under the pressure of the 15 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, the expressions of the 10 sages became more and more unsightly. The pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that they controlled were gradually damaged at this time. Each pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure had more or less scars on its body. However, it was impossible for the result to be completely revealed in a short period of time. After all, although the power of the 15 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures was much stronger than the 10 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, they had more scruples. After all, destruction was not their ultimate goal. The goal of the Genesis sages was to reconstruct the great Tao of that world. In the process, they would prove their Tao and become sages that belonged to two sides of the world. Such an ultimate goal obviously made it impossible for them to sit back and watch the world be destroyed. This was also the reason why they had to separate 3 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures to protect the great Tao on both sides, even though they had 18 sages. However, for the original sages of that world, reconstructing the great Tao was obviously unacceptable. This was because they were sages that had proven their Tao and become sages based on the original great Tao. If the great Tao was reconstructed, then the Tao that they had proven would naturally no longer be compatible with the great Tao of that world. They would naturally lose their sage positions and would no longer be able to become sages. At that time, if they wanted to regain their sage positions, it would be hundreds or even thousands of times more difficult than an ordinary level 9 pseudo-sage or an ordinary supreme venerable. After all, they did not become sages by cultivating the magical powers of the real sages. Instead, they became sages by cultivating the original great Tao of that world. In the new world, it was obvious that they had to abandon the cultivation path that they had originally cultivated to the level of the sages and create another cultivation path. The difficulty of this was naturally 100 or even 1,000 times more difficult than creating a cultivation path out of thin air. Not to mention that they were now opposing the sages of the new world. If they lost their sage positions, how would the sages treat them? How would they torture them? This was obviously something that they absolutely could not accept. Therefore, it was obvious that if they saw that the situation was not harmonious, what these sages would do was to completely destroy the world. Before they were completely destroyed, they would be destroyed along with the world. They would not leave any benefits to the other sages who had destroyed them. Chapter 1486. Because of this worry, the Genesis saint and the others were extremely anxious. Naturally, They weren't able to perfectly display the advantage of having 5 pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasures. It was easy to gain the upper hand, but it clearly wasn't easy to completely suppress them. Watermark, add test, watermark, add test. But even so, the situation was gradually tilting in the Genesis Saints' favor. If there were no other methods, the fate of the 10 sages was almost set in stone. Be it Luo Fan or any of the sages present, they all knew this very well. The 10 sages were no exception. Suddenly, among the 10 sages, an elderly sage turned his hand and suddenly blasted his primordial origin spirit treasure directly at the great Tao they were originally guarding. Following his actions, the other 9 sages also turned their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures around and bombarded the great Tao that had bestowed upon them the position of sage, making them eternal, indestructible, omniscient, and omnipotent. Obviously, after seeing the final outcome, the 10 sages were in complete despair. They finally decided to perish together with the world. They would use their own deaths and the destruction of the world to resist the Genesis sage and the others. Even though the Genesis sage and the others had expected such a move, they could not help but be shocked. Everyone could no longer maintain their cold and indifferent expressions. Faint traces of nervousness could be seen on their faces. Seeing this, their 15 pseudo-primordial spirit treasures rapidly emitted a mysterious strength that rumbled towards the 10 pseudo-primordial spirit treasures. They wanted to intercept the 10 pseudo-primordial spirit treasures from harming the great Tao. However, it was a pity that sages were a little slower in their attacks. That was a world of difference. The 10 sages attacked first, while the Genesis sage and the others attacked later. During this time, they had to change the direction of their attacks towards the 10 sages and intercept the 10 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. This was one step too slow. In an instant, before their 15 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures could intercept those 10 magic treasures, the power of those 10 magic treasures exploded out. It had already bombarded the great Tao. Although there were several pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures guarding the great Tao, however, this kind of protection could be used to defend against the aftermath of a battle. Naturally, it would not be a problem for it to resist some sage-level attacks that were not aimed at them. However, it was used to withstand the attacks of the 10 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. It was obvious that he was still lacking in strength. In particular, at this moment, the fake sage who was controlling the 10 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures was attacking with the determination to perish together with them. It was naturally impossible to resist. In the blink of an eye, almost at the same time that the attack occurred, the defensive pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures were instantly broken apart. Several magic treasures were instantly shaken off. The power of those 10 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures was completely used on the great Tao. This terrifying power happened in the blink of an eye. It had already caused the great Tao to collapse, causing the originally boundless great Tao that could bestow the sainthood of many living beings to collapse. It turned into countless fragments. The moment the great Tao collapsed, the auras of the 10 fake sages and their natal magic treasures, which are also the 10 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures, instantly started to rapidly decrease like a landslide and a tsunami. They quickly collapsed. In the blink of an eye, all of them had regressed and sunk to the level of a supreme expert. However, the collapse of the great Tao directly caused the supreme sainthood that they had obtained from the great Tao to completely collapse and disappear. When they were still sages, they naturally had an extremely powerful defense against the fluctuations and pressure emitted by the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. It was enough for them to ignore all kinds of fluctuations and pressure. However, at this moment, when they had lost their sainthood, the fluctuations and pressure had already far exceeded the limits that they could withstand. In just an instant, the 10 former fake sages were crushed by the fluctuations. Even their life origin completely disappeared in an instant. Even their luck worlds in the long river of luck completely collapsed and disappeared at the same time. This was even more thorough than the destruction of their body and soul. However, at this moment, the Genesis sage and the others were no longer in the mood to pay attention to them. At this moment, the 19 sages attacked at the same time and started to collect the numerous great Tao fragments with their own methods. The 18 sages with the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had it easier. They only used their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to collect the billions of great Tao fragments. However, it was not so easy for the rock saint who had just become a fake sage. At this moment, he used a series of mysterious sage abilities that turned into a huge net that continuously swept towards the billions of great Tao fragments. The great Tao fragments were formed from the shattering of the great Tao, and every single one of them was extremely mysterious. Even at this moment, they were naturally evolving into billions of unbelievable scenes, forming countless unimaginable worlds. If they fell into any world, even if it was a major thousand world, they would produce unbelievable power and cause unbelievable changes to the world. In the end, the major thousand world would be as close to the world that had just shattered not long ago as possible. Even a level 9 pseudo-sage or a supreme expert would need to expend a lot of effort and make countless preparations to collect an existence like that. However, at this moment, it was like sand to these sages, and they were easily collected. The 18 sages with the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had the help of their treasures, so they collected much more than the rock saint. However, this was normal. They had fought against the 10 sages, but the rock saint was just watching from the side. Under such circumstances, it was reasonable for them to collect more spoils of war. At this moment, Luo Fan did not stand on ceremony. He raised his hand, and the pseudo-sage abilities condensed into a huge net that started to collect the countless fragments. Although he did not directly compete with the other pseudo-sages, there was still an intense competition to collect as many great Tao fragments as possible. No matter how one looked at it, the great Tao fragments were rare treasures. Moreover, this was all their harvest after destroying that world, the 10 sages, and the countless major thousand worlds in the surroundings. If they let this go, wouldn't their efforts this time be in vain? As an existence recognized by the Genesis saint as the 20th sage, no one dared to say anything when Luo Fan collected these fragments. On the contrary, it was him who did not collect them. This would make those sages feel that they had missed out on something good. The process of collecting the great Tao fragments lasted for what everyone felt was dozens of breaths. Soon, all the fragments had disappeared, and they were all collected by the 20 of them, although the great Tao had shattered into billions of fragments. However, to the sages and Luo Fan, they could completely grasp the traces of every fragment. Naturally, they would not miss out on any fragments. Even the tiniest fragment had been collected by them. Among the fragments they had collected, the number of fragments they had collected was the most correct. It was the Genesis saint. The one who had collected the least was not Luo Fan, but the rock saint. Although Luo Fan was slower than the rock saint, he was more familiar with this void than the rock saint. However, he was more familiar with this void than the boulder saint, and the saint ability he chose was more suitable for this void than the boulder saint. In the end, he caught up to the boulder saint and collected more fragments of the great Tao than the boulder saint. Of course, regardless of whether he had collected more or less than the rock saint, the great Tao fragments he had collected were clearly not comparable to those of the other sages who had pseudo-chaotic origin spiritual treasures. After all, he had used an ability to collect them. Compared to the other sages who used pseudo-chaotic origin spiritual treasures, it was like the difference between catching fish with one's hands and fishing nets. No matter how fast he was and how exquisite his movements were, it was impossible to eliminate the difference in the nature of these tools. After collecting the fragments of the Great Path, the flying sword formed by the world floated in the void and began to quiet down. Of course, the war could not continue forever. Even sages needed to rest for a period of time to digest what they had gained from the battle before starting another round of war. Although they had not truly completed their initial goal, which was to reconstruct the Great Tao so that they could prove their Tao and become sages in that world, becoming sages of two worlds at the same time. However, at this moment, the 19 sages did not show any disappointment on their faces, nor did they show any anger. Every one of them appeared rather calm. Since it was a war, it was impossible for everything to go according to plan. Comparatively speaking, even though they hadn't achieved their initial goal, gathering so many Grand Tao fragments could already be considered as an acceptable gain. Luo Fan did not care about the other sages. At this moment, he opened his right hand and looked at the over 30 trillion tiny fragments that seemed to attract and repel each other. These fragments were Great Tao fragments. Of course, the true appearance of these Great Tao fragments could not possibly be so small. The reason why they appeared as tiny as dust particles was because Luo Fan had purposely suppressed them to make it easier for him to observe. Otherwise, if he released them in their original form, they would cover the sky and cover the earth. Even if he could study them, it would obviously be inconvenient. Every single one of these Grand Tao fragments contained extremely deep and profound profundities of the Grand Tao. These mysteries were different from the mysteries of the Great Tao contained in ordinary major chiliocosms. They contained many Tao of pseudo-saints. If an ordinary cultivator obtained any of these fragments and tried his best to comprehend the mysteries within, it would naturally be a little exaggerated to raise his cultivation realm to the point of becoming a saint. However, it would definitely not be a problem for his cultivation realm to surpass ordinary supreme venerables. This was not a problem of the quantity of the mysteries of the Great Tao. In terms of quantity, how could the mysteries of the Great Tao fragments be compared to the mysteries of the Great Tao comprehended by a supreme venerable? The reason why it had such a great effect and could allow a supreme venerable to surpass his own kind was because of the quantity of the mysteries of the Great Tao fragments. The fundamental reason was because of the quality of the mysteries of the Great Tao contained in the Great Tao fragments. The mysteries of the Great Tao that had already transformed and reached the level of the Tao of sages were enough to become the key for a supreme venerable to surpass his limits and comprehend some of the Tao of sages. This was different from a true, complete Great Tao. As a fragment of the Great Tao, without the protection of a complete Great Tao, cultivators would not be disturbed by the mysteries of the other Great Tao when comprehending this fragment. There were not too many mysteries of the Great Tao interwoven together, causing the difficulty of comprehension to be greatly reduced. Such a fragment of the Great Tao, even for Luo Fan, was a good thing. However, he had already grasped the supreme authority of a powerful world that was about to be raised to the level of a perfect world. Under such circumstances, the mysteries of the Great Tao contained within it were nothing to him. He was able to comprehend and understand the complete Grand Tao down to the finest detail at any time, so all the profundities of the Grand Tao contained within these Grand Tao fragments could be obtained with a single thought to him. So it was naturally nothing. What made him feel it was precious? It was the fragment of the Great Tao itself. Because this was a fragment of the Great Tao that had already surpassed an ordinary world. Not only was its essence extremely high, it also contained the Tao of sages. It was a natural treasure that could be used to refine primordial spiritual treasures. Moreover, because this primordial spiritual treasure was refined from a fragment of the Great Tao, it would not be like an ordinary primordial spiritual treasure that could only possess the power of a primordial spiritual treasure in the world it was formed in. If it left this world, its essence would be reduced to the realm of a primordial spiritual treasure and fall to the level of a supreme treasure. However, it could be used at any time in any world. It could maintain this kind of power in any world. Of course, this was only in the world. It was naturally impossible for a normal primordial spiritual treasure to have the power to travel freely in the state of chaos. This was the true magical use of the Great Tao fragment. This pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure could only possess the power of a primordial origin spiritual treasure in this world. This was not contradictory to the fact that the Genesis Saint and the others had used the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure to enter another place to fight against the 10 false sages. This was because at that time, the great Tao of the two worlds had already been connected. At that time, that place was actually not much different from the original world. Naturally, it could also display the powerful power of the primordial origin spiritual treasure. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He already knew that at this moment, all the sages, including the Boulder Saint, were refining the great Tao fragments with their natal magic treasures. If their life's magic tools were to fuse together with these great Tao fragments, then not only would they be able to obtain the effects of a pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure refined from these great Tao fragments, but their might would become even more formidable, even more terrifying. With such benefits, why wouldn't they do it? The Boulder Saint did not have his own pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, but he had his own natal magic treasure, a natal magic treasure that was only a supremacy treasure. If this kind of magic treasure was combined with the great Tao fragments, it could naturally become a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure. Although its power would be weaker than the magic treasures of other sages, it was not inferior to ordinary pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. Pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure. This seems to be a good choice, Luo Fan thought to himself. He had not stopped moving. He began to connect his power and began to condense the more than 30 trillion tiny great Tao fragments in his hand. If he had a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, he would no longer need to obtain the supreme authority of a certain world to make a false saint worry. Instead, he could directly rely on this pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure to ensure his own safety in front of false saint, but only to ensure his own safety. If he lost the supreme authority, his understanding of the way of sages would disappear. By then, although this pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure could match the power of a false saint, he would not be able to use it to perform the sage's abilities. It was obviously impossible for him to defeat a false saint. As he condensed, the more than 30 trillion great Tao fragments gradually began to condense together. Originally, the great Tao fragments had the characteristic of attracting and repelling each other. If he wanted to condense them together, he only needed to slightly suppress their repelling force, and the attraction force would naturally condense them together into a ball. Suppressing the attraction force between the great Tao fragments was an impossible task for ordinary supremacies, but for Luo Fan, who had the supreme authority, it could not be any easier. The great Tao fragments were extremely mysterious. Although they were fragments that were not continuous, there were many faults and many flaws between them. However, when they condensed into one, the mysteries of the great Tao during this period were connected and flowed with each other. In the end, they actually condensed into an extremely perfect whole. In fact, vaguely, the mysteries of the great Tao that were originally missing had naturally evolved, allowing these great Tao fragments to condense into an extremely complete and perfect great Tao at first glance. Looking at the great Tao in his hands, which he did not know the beginning and the end, a faint smile appeared on his face. With a thought, he raised his hand and summoned his divine court heaven cauldron. Although this divine court heaven cauldron was refined with the life treasure of the level 9 fake Saint Venerable as the source. But now, after being refined by Luo Fan countless times, after he had used it countless times, it had already undergone an earth-shattering transformation from the main body's natal magic treasure. Now, even if the true Venerable came here, he would not dare to admit that this was developed from his life treasure. Luo Fan looked at the divine court heaven cauldron. He raised his hand and made a grabbing motion, pressing the great Tao condensed from more than 30 trillion great Tao fragments onto the divine court heaven cauldron. In an instant, the divine court heaven cauldron trembled slightly. With a muffled bang, the entire divine court heaven cauldron exploded, turning into a strange smoke that began to tumble in front of Luo Fan. Many strands of holy wool were shaken out in an instant, and in the blink of an eye, they were crushed, collapsed, and disappeared without a trace. Then, countless strands of black smoke steamed out of the smoke and gradually dissipated in the void. Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. He knew that this was the process of the great Tao changing and refining the divine court heaven cauldron. As for the holy wills, it was precisely because the great Tao had entered that it was naturally expelled and crushed. The great Tao itself contained the true and complete way of the saint, while the holy wills were merely evolved from the way of the saint and formed from a different way of cultivation. The two were like one. The difference between the two was like a genuine imitation. It would be fine if they didn't encounter each other, but how could they coexist after encountering each other? As for the quenching material, there was no need to mention it. It was originally just a material that carried the holy will. So how could it directly bear the great Tao that contained the complete way of the saint? How could the great Tao remain in it without going through countless rounds of refinement and improvement? After a rough calculation, Luo Fan knew that this refining process would be extremely long, and it could not be skipped at all. How could he have so much time to waste on waiting? With a thought, he raised his hand, and the flow of time in the smoke in front of him began to accelerate wildly. 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. In the end, he accelerated the flow of time to the limit that this world could bear 2 billion times. If Luo Fan had not obtained the supreme authority of this world, it would have been impossible for him to reach this speed of time, and it would have been impossible for him to maintain it. But now, it was naturally not difficult at all for him. He even seemed extremely relaxed and at ease because of this. Time passed slowly, and in the blink of an eye, several days had passed. In the area where the flow of time was accelerated, these several days were tens of millions of years. Finally, at a certain moment, the tumbling smoke in the area where the flow of time was accelerated suddenly trembled. Then it shrank and condensed into a solid body. This solid body was a three-legged cauldron. However, compared to before, its surface had undergone earth-shattering changes. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron looked like it had been carved out of a large stone with an extremely crude technique. It barely revealed the appearance of a three-legged cauldron. Whether it was on the surface or inside, it was densely packed with countless deep and shallow lines. At first glance, these markings didn't seem to have any pattern, nor did they seem miraculous. However, if one were to look carefully, one would notice that every single marking was filled with dense talisman markings. In fact, every single line within the runes was a new layer of runes. Just like that, the cycle repeated endlessly and without end. Seeing the three-legged cauldron appear, Luo Fan was overjoyed. He knew that his pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure had been completed before he could do anything. The three-legged cauldron trembled slightly, and the area where the flow of time was accelerated instantly returned to normal. Then, the entire world suddenly shook violently, and countless tiny cracks began to appear on the three-legged cauldron, spreading to the entire world. Chapter 1487. This terrifying commotion instantly attracted the attention of all the sages in the world. In an instant, the power of the 18 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures was released at the same time. They either enveloped the great Tao, enveloped the rules and laws, protected space-time, or protected everything in the world. In the blink of an eye, the terrifying impact caused by the formation of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures was completely eliminated. The world instantly returned to normal. Watermark advertisement test, however, it looked no different from before, and he could not feel any movement here. At this moment, the three-legged cauldron in front of Luo Fan swayed slightly, and all the powerful aura disappeared completely. It looked like a different three-legged cauldron that floated quietly in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan looked at the three-legged cauldron and raised his hand to grab it. The three-legged cauldron landed in his hand. As soon as he touched it, he felt a wonderful feeling that was different from the supreme authority, but it also brought him endless power. The moment he fused his soul with the three-legged cauldron, a feeling as if he had transformed into an eternal and indestructible sage appeared in his heart. This feeling was so wonderful and so novel that he could not help but wear a faint smile on his face. Although this was a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, and its power was comparable to that of a false sage, because it was refined by Luo Fan himself, the material on it contained his deepest imprint. Therefore, at this moment, he did not even encounter much difficulty and had already refined this magic treasure to an unshakable state. He had become the only true owner of this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Even a false sage would not be able to deprive him of the ownership of this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. As Luo Fan kept the magic treasure, the pressure that the magic treasure produced on the world naturally disappeared without a trace. With the disappearance of the pressure, the dozen or so false sages naturally did not need to continue blocking the pressure that this magic treasure had on the world. In the blink of an eye, the power of all the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures was withdrawn and completely disappeared. The entire world returned to normal. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat as he felt some kind of summoning. In an instant, he knew what was going on. He waved his hand. The surroundings turned into a wondrous state of chaos. After the transformation, he discovered that the 19 sages, including the monolith saint, had appeared not far away from him. Although this world could give birth to a false sage, it was not a truly perfect world. Such a world, it did not have the characteristics of perfect heaven and earth. As for this strange state of chaos, it was like a state of chaos. However, it was unable to completely isolate them. No matter where, as long as this strange state of chaos appeared, it would naturally connect with the previous strange state that existed. Just like that. Now it was like this. It was clear that although the saints were at the various fulcrum points of the world, they were still unable to move. However, they had already set up the strange, dusky state and used the characteristics of the strange state to gather together again. Congratulations on successfully refining a sage treasure, fellow Taoist, the monolith saint said. Luo Fan smiled and said, I barely succeeded. Compared to the gains of a sage, it's nothing. After that, the saints also congratulated Luo Fan for truly obtaining a sage treasure and truly stepping into the level of the sage realm. Although he had only reached this level with the help of a magic treasure, he had reached it. Regardless of whether it was through strength or external forces, as long as he reached this level, it was enough for them to treat him as an equal. Luo Fan responded to everyone's congratulations one by one. After that, the sages went their separate ways. They had only summoned Luo Fan this time to express their congratulations and did not have any other specific matters. Now that it was settled, there was naturally no need to continue like this. After leaving the strange state, Luo Fan returned to the fulcrum point and began to carefully comprehend the divine court heavenly cauldron that had been upgraded to the level of a pseudo-chaotic spiritual treasure. A pseudo-chaotic spiritual treasure was equivalent to a pseudo-sage. Even though Luo Fan was the one who refined it, it was impossible for him to completely understand all the mysteries within it. Naturally, he still had to carefully comprehend and savor it. Time slowly passed while he was in the process of comprehending. In the blink of an eye, another few days passed. At a certain moment after a few days, a strange tremor suddenly occurred somewhere in the world. It instantly swept through the entire world, causing countless tiny cracks to appear. It seemed as if the world was condensed from countless tiny cracks and would completely collapse in the next instant. At the same time, the Tao of the world seemed to be under unbearable pressure. Countless tiny cracks appeared on it, and it also seemed like it would completely collapse in the next instant. As soon as this happened, Luo Fan immediately understood what was going on. With a thought, he unleashed the power of the heavenly tripod of the divine court and instantly suppressed the great path of the world. The terrifying pressure that was acting on the great path, which was enough to cause countless cracks to appear on the great path, was completely blocked. The cracks on the great path gradually healed and disappeared in the blink of an eye. "I've finally refined it," Luo Fan thought to himself. His eyes pierced through the endless space-time, and he saw the monolith saint who was standing on a certain fulcrum of the world. At this moment, there was only an extremely ordinary-looking net in the monolith saint's hand. This net was extremely mysterious and profound. Although it did not emit any energy, its existence alone was already suppressing the world, the Tao of the world, and the laws of the world. The countless cracks that had appeared on the Tao, the countless cracks that had appeared in the world, and even the countless cracks that had appeared on the layer of laws were none other than this net. Only a pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure could accomplish this. Obviously, although the monolith saint was a few days slower than Luo Fan, he had already fused the Tao fragment he had obtained with his life treasure to form a pseudo-chaotic spiritual treasure. When Luo Fan made his move, the other sages also made their moves. They protected a certain element of the world so that it would not be destroyed by this newly formed treasure. The monolith saint's eyes flickered with a hint of wisdom. Faintly, there seemed to be an endless amount of mysterious principles emerging from the depths of his eyes. They lingered in his eyes, persisted, and finally disappeared. After a while, the monolith saint raised his hand and waved. The net landed in his hand. As the treasure landed in his hand, the pressure produced by the treasure itself seemed to have been completely restrained. This made Luo Fan and the other saints feel that the great power that was suppressing the power of their magic weapons had completely disappeared at this time. How could they not understand such a change? This was clearly a sign that the monolith saint had completely grasped the pseudo-chaotic spiritual treasure that he had successfully refined. After understanding this, they all put away their pseudo-chaotic spiritual treasures in tacit understanding. In the blink of an eye, he completely released the shackles on this world. This world regained its freedom. With a thought from Luo Fan, a strange state appeared in his surroundings. Immediately after, he saw all the sages, including the monolith saint, appearing not far away from him. "Congratulations, sages. You can only refine a sage treasure." Luo Fan congratulated the monolith saint with a smile. The monolith saint returned the greeting. "At least I didn't fall too far behind you, fellow Taoist. It's not too embarrassing." At this moment, the other sages also went up to congratulate him. With the monolith saint's response, an indescribably harmonious scene appeared. At this moment, everyone, including Luo Fan, had a change in their expressions as they cast their gazes outside of this world. "Looks like we've become prey." The Genesis saint smiled faintly. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled bitterly and said, "Looks like it's quite popular. There are actually so many worlds taking action." At this moment, outside this world, there were 5 worlds that were no different from this world. They were coming toward this world from all directions. Each of these worlds emitted an aura that could only be emitted by a world with a saint. This aura made both Luo Fan and the Genesis saint instantly understand that each of these worlds had a certain number of sages, or rather, a certain number of false sages. From the looks of it, it was very obvious that the actions of this world back then had made them feel threatened. Thus, they had used some sort of method to join forces, intending to strike first and destroy this world first. These worlds did not condense into flying swords or other magic treasures like this world. However, it was not as if they had directly arrived without being condensed. In fact, these worlds had all condensed into the shape of pills. The round lump's appearance was extremely mysterious and profound. However, regardless of whether it was the Genesis Saint or Luo Fan, both of them knew very well that even though these shiny round pills looked so wonderful, they were only chosen out of helplessness. It was because they didn't have enough saints, so they couldn't perfectly condense the heaven and earth. That was why they chose this method that seemed magical but was actually the easiest to condense. Moreover, the number of saints needed to condense the heaven and earth was also the lowest. 10, 8, 8, 9, 7. A trace of joy flashed in the Genesis saint's eyes as he said. Although he did not complete his sentence, Everyone knew that he was talking about the number of sages in those worlds. It was clear that among the 5 worlds, the one with the most saints only had 10. The lowest number was only 7 sages. There was no possibility of reconciliation between these worlds. Lu Fuan's side knew this, and so did the 42 sages on the other side. Therefore, when they met, there was no need for any words. They knew each other's determination, and they also knew the only choice they had. Therefore, when they met, there was no need for words or communication. The war immediately broke out. The 5 worlds clearly had an extremely deep connection with each other. At this moment, after they arrived in this void, they actually communicated with each other. Their powers interacted with each other, forming an indescribable array formation in the void, wrapping the flying sword formed from the heavens and the earth within it. The power of the array formation that was set up using a world with a false sage as the formation point was beyond anyone's imagination. Even if it was Luo Fan, before he encountered it, he could not imagine how terrifying its power was. Although there were only 5 formation points, the changes that could be derived from them were almost endless. The number of array formations that could be set up was also unimaginable. In the hands of the sages, the power that they displayed was so strong. It was even more indescribable with words. Within the array, the surrounding void was completely sealed. A power that could even crush any part of the world was used in this void, suppressing the flying sword that existed in this void. This made Luo Fan and the others feel that it had become difficult to control the fulcrum. They could even vaguely feel that. There was an inexplicable rebounding force coming from the fulcrum. This was the terrifying power of the array formation that was created by a world with a false sage. At this time, the sages naturally could not still be in that strange state. They all went to congratulate the Boulder Saint, including Luo Fan. All of them returned to the fulcrum of the world that they were responsible for. As they returned, the flying sword seemed to suddenly come to life. As it trembled slightly, a wave of sword light erupted from it. The sword light did not directly condense into a world of sword light. Instead, it condensed into an incomparably pure destructive force that directly blasted towards a certain tiny flaw in the formation that was formed by the 5 worlds. To a sage, the profoundness of any changes in the array formation could not be hidden. If other sages could set it up, then the sages that they were dealing with would naturally know the profoundness of the array and would naturally be able to find a way to break it. However, it was obvious that no sage was a fool. Knowing that this would happen, the 42 false sages who had set up the array naturally had corresponding countermeasures. At this moment, the array changed slightly, instantly changing from its original appearance to a completely new state. The entire array from the inside to the outside, from top to bottom, looked completely different from before. However, its power was still as powerful and terrifying as before. It exerted great pressure on the flying sword-like world. As soon as the formation changed, the Genesis Sage and the others were able to discover the mystery behind it. Immediately, the sword light of the flying sword changed direction again. It resisted the terrifying power of the array and blasted towards the newly formed array. That was not the flaw of the formation. Next, a series of offensive and defensive changes that dazzled even Luo Fan appeared. The array instantly displayed countless extremely mysterious changes, and the flying sword formed by the world displayed countless mysterious and profound sword techniques. The sword lights seemed to be living creatures with powerful intelligence, constantly searching for the weaknesses of the array and constantly targeting them. Both sides fell into a stalemate. That formation was unable to truly restrict the flying sword, but this flying sword was also unable to shatter the formation. It directly escaped, and from the outside, it broke through the 5 skies one by one. During this process, Luo Fan could faintly sense that the perception belonging to a saint seemed to have swept through this place of nothingness. Although false sages were restricted in the world, their fates were connected to the world. However, This did not mean that they were completely unaware of the scene outside the world. In fact, false sages were extremely intelligent and had endless magic power. It was very easy for them to think of a way to get around this restriction. The reason why they did not do this in the past and did not find other worlds with false sages was because they all thought that their world was the only one. Other worlds and worlds were far inferior to their world. Now that they knew the existence of other false sages, how could they not work in this direction? How could they not discover the fierce battle between the 6 worlds with false sages that had occurred in this void? We must end this battle quickly. Otherwise, I'm afraid that both sides will become losers, the Genesis Saint said. As he spoke, the Genesis Saint raised his hand and pointed. His pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure directly appeared. In a flash, it left this part of the world. Everyone was naturally very clear about the Genesis Saint's worries. If they did not quickly deal with their opponents and quickly escape from this almost endless battle, they and the 5 worlds in front of them would become the prey of the other worlds. If that happened, they would all become losers. At this moment, seeing the Genesis Saint's actions, they naturally understood his plan. Without hesitation, they immediately released their own pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. They rushed out of this world. They began to spread their power endlessly. Normal pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures could only have the great power of being eternal, indestructible, and omnipotent in the world they had created. Once they left this world, unless they relied on the great Tao of the world like before. Otherwise, they would definitely be knocked down, from a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure to a supreme treasure. However, it was obvious that this principle was not applicable to the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures of the Genesis Saint and the others. Obviously, it was wrong. These pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had all been integrated with the great Tao fragments. Internally, it was equivalent to slacking off a part of the great Tao of the Sage Tao. It was equivalent to carrying the great Tao of the world they had created with them. However, they were not limited by the shackles of this world at all. Instead, they could display unimaginable power in any place and in any area. For example, at this moment, in the void, the power that these 20 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures erupted, shaking the void around them. It directly suppressed hundreds of millions of major kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and minor kiliocosms. Even the numerous worlds with false sages were shaken by the aura of these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. This change instantly made all the powerful cultivators, including the sages, who were observing this change in the countless worlds, speechless. This situation had already subverted their common sense, making them feel that their views had been greatly challenged. How is this possible? If the sage treasures can transcend the shackles of this world, then what is the essential difference between a false sage and a true sage? This was the thought that appeared in the hearts of the sages. However, the sages were sages after all. Although they were confused at the beginning and could not understand it all, they quickly figured out the mystery behind it. But they soon understood the mysteries behind this. They knew just what it was that caused these pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures to surpass their own world. I didn't expect the great Tao of other worlds to have such an effect. This thought gradually provoked their desire to fight. It made even the originally peaceful sages who were unwilling to fight start to think about their next target. Even the sages who originally wanted to take advantage of the 6 worlds that were currently at war no longer had the same thought at this time. It was obviously not an advantage, but a hard bone that could not be any harder. For a moment, the perception of those false sages, who were using various special methods to spy on this place, was completely reduced at this time. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared without a trace at this time. In the 5 worlds that were besieging this flying sword, a total of 42 sages, although their expressions did not change and their movements did not stop, in their hearts, they already knew that they had made the wrong choice. If the power of each pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure could be exerted, It could actually be compared to a powerful world that could give birth to a sage. After all, it was a world. No matter how much it changed or how much it strengthened, it was still a world in itself. It was not used as a weapon or a magic treasure to fight. In contrast, although the power of transforming it into a magic treasure was extremely powerful because of its extremely powerful nature, compared to a magic treasure that specialized in fighting, it was only about the same as a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Now, 20 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had suddenly appeared. In addition to the world that had already condensed into a flying sword, this was equivalent to them facing 21 worlds with the power of their 5 worlds. If their magic treasures could also break away from the shackles of the world, then there was still a possibility of victory. As for now, there was obviously only one result. They were all sages, so there was naturally no need to say much about the advantages and disadvantages of the situation. The 42 sages reached a consensus in an instant. In an instant, the formation formed by the 5 skies twisted, and their direction instantly changed. From their original state of besieging the flying sword, they abruptly changed into a form that could greatly increase their flying speed. They rapidly shot off in a certain direction, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. Chapter 1488. The 5 skies had chosen to flee, which was unacceptable to the Genesis sage and the others. Because of these 5 worlds, they had already exposed their pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures that could maintain their might outside of the world. This caused even more worlds to be wary of them, and it would be even more troublesome to deal with them in the future. More importantly, the 5 worlds represented his 5 great Daos that could support the existence of a false sage. Like this, how could they possibly let these 5 skies directly escape? Thus, at this moment, when the Genesis saints saw the 5 worlds flee, he and the others naturally stimulated the flying sword world, as well as the 20 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures to chase after the 5 worlds. Although this flying sword was agile and extremely fast, it was still able to move at the speed of light. The power of those 20 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures was also terrifying. But the array formation formed by the 5 directional worlds wasn't slow either. As the chase continued, the distance between the 2 sides didn't decrease by much. Instead, he maintained a general distance as he headed into the depths of the void. Within this void, there were many worlds. The great 1,000 worlds were densely arranged, each of them emitting an indescribable spiritual light that illuminated the void. This made the void look like a boundless starry sky. The great 1,000 worlds were like the stars in this universe. As for the worlds that could give birth to sages, they were like huge river systems. Looking at it from this angle, the void was even livelier and more gorgeous than an ordinary starry sky in the universe. In such a place, the flying sword chased after the formation formed by the 5 worlds. It looked like a river system was chasing after the huge system formed by the other 5 river systems. Such a scene was really shocking. Not long after, they had already left the original void. More and more vast 1,000 realms gradually appeared in the surroundings. This was clearly a sign that they had reached beyond the scope of the residual effects of the battle between them. As for these boundless worlds, whether it was the 5 great skies or the Genesis saint, none of them cared. If they weren't blocking their way, they naturally wouldn't bother with them. But if they were blocking their way, they wouldn't be stingy to exterminate them. Along the way, one great 1,000 world after another was destroyed by the 5 direction skies. The fragments of the countless worlds were turned into the driving force of the 5 direction skies, causing the speed of the 5 direction skies formation to increase. As for the flying sword, naturally, there was no need to use this method. Its condensing effect was unimaginably powerful. After it was condensed, it was almost like a real flying sword. When it activated the flying sword technique, its speed seemed to become more and more astonishing. It was an increase in speed that was not the slightest bit inferior to that of the 5 regions world. It maintained a speed that was neither too far nor too close between the 2 sides. At this moment, in the nothingness of the entire Earth's universe, all the worlds with sages began to move. The worlds that had not been condensed before were condensed one by one. The originally loose worlds were now transformed into extremely special magic treasures. However, even though the appearance of those worlds had changed, they were still the same. However, the light that they emitted did not change. From a perspective of the void, even though their forms had changed, they still looked like galaxies. After they condensed and obtained the ability to move, it looked like the entire lifeless starry sky of the universe had suddenly come to life, bringing along countless stars. Gradually, their forms began to change, and they began to move according to various purposes, and inexplicable vitality began to gradually spread. Wars began to break out everywhere, apart from the Genesis Saint, who had already turned into a flying sword, everywhere else in the world. They also began to enter a state of war. Waves of power of the world appeared in the nothingness, spreading, sweeping across the entire nothingness, constantly reverberating. As time passed, more and more worlds were gradually being destroyed. Gradually, there were worlds that perished together. Gradually, more and more sages appeared. They refined their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures into the fragments of the great Tao, raising them to a level where they could maintain their power outside of the world. This further encouraged the war, causing the already intense war to become even more intense, causing the already chaotic situation to become even more chaotic. However, this was a drastic change that could only be detected among the various worlds and sages. For cultivators who could not look at the problem from a macro perspective, even the strongest venerables, it was difficult for them to detect this true change. They would only feel that the space-time channel that entered a certain world had suddenly stopped responding. They would only suddenly feel that a certain world seemed to have disappeared, and they would only find that the friends that were originally in that world had suddenly lost contact. They would even feel that their vision had suddenly turned black, and everything in their world, including their vitality, had been taken away in an instant. This was all they could feel. As for the reason for this change, what drove this change and why this situation occurred, they could only rely on guesses. They could only push the blame to the sages, but they could not really understand the reason. They also did not know how chaotic the entire Earth's universe was at this time. However, even such a drastic change, such chaos for the real Earth's universe. In other words, there were no traces of the 7 true saints that would one day shatter and become the universe where the cycles of eras rotated, not to mention participating in this chaos. Even the demon realm seemed to have an extremely high status. Although many sages had sensed the existence of the demon realm, and many sages had even seen the demon realm from afar, none of them had ever dared to have any ideas about the demon realm. The demon realm that had 54 sages was so powerful that it far surpassed other worlds that had sages. Even just by sensing its aura, no sages dared to challenge it. Even those sages that had condensed their own worlds into powerful treasures that gave them incredible power did not dare to have any ideas about the demon realm that had not changed at all. The situation between the various worlds had changed in such a way. This did not matter at all to the Genesis Saints. At the very least, they did not care. At this time, they were still pursuing the 5 worlds. In the void, even time did not exist. However, for the various worlds, if there were no special changes, their natural flow of time would be in line with the time dimension of the Earth's universe. It was precisely because they were all in line with the time dimension that the flow of time and the time dimension between the various worlds were synchronized. There was no difference at all. However, this was only a natural state. If there was no change in power, the flow of time and the time dimension were naturally like this. However, if there was a powerful force to change it, then the flow of time would naturally undergo a huge change. For example, the power of a sage. Now, between the flying sword and the formation formed by the 5 worlds, the power of a sage was surging, causing the great Tao of each other to affect and clash with each other. This, in the end, completely changed the various aspects of the 2 worlds. This included the rules and laws, as well as space. even time. As a result, this resulted in the current situation. To the outside world, only a few days had passed, but to both sides, it felt like thousands of years had passed. During these thousands of years, one side was chasing the other, while the other side was fleeing. Occasionally, they would stop to fight, but it evolved into all sorts of extremely wonderful and tragic scenes of war. In the first place, the Genesis Saints had the upper hand in terms of strength. During these thousands of years, although the Saints of the Five Worlds had come up with countless methods, they used countless methods to block and dodge, but in the end, they gradually fell into a disadvantageous position. Gradually, they were forced into a corner by the flying sword and the 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. On this day, when the Saints of the Five Worlds finally realized that something was wrong, they were already surrounded by the 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. The 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures had indeed shocked the entire void, causing all living beings in the world to feel it, causing countless saints to be vigilant. However, this was only at the beginning. Now, more and more saints had fused the fragments of the great Tao into the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. This caused more and more pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures to appear in the void. Of course, most of the saints did not use these pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures to attack, but used them for defense. They had their own pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures surrounding their world. They were connected to each other, and as their power communicated and circulated, they carried out an extremely tight defense against all hostility from the outside world. They wanted to dispel the thoughts of other sages and other worlds against their world. Thus, even though the aura of these 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures was still shocking, it was no longer as conspicuous as a guiding light in the darkness as it had been in the past. Instead, it was almost lost in the crowd. Surrounded by these 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and the world, the five worlds fell silent. Begging for mercy naturally would not happen between saints. For existences like saints, their persistence towards their own path, their implementation of their own will, they had reached a realm where the great Tao almost surpassed everything. If an action did not achieve a certain result, they would absolutely not give up. The 42 saints of the five worlds clearly knew that since their opponents had chased them for thousands of years, it was naturally impossible for them to let them go. It was impossible for them to spare these worlds. Perhaps they will have internal strife. At this time, Luo Fan sighed. His heavenly cauldron of the divine court was also a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, but now it was similarly surrounding the five worlds. Regarding the development of the situation, naturally, he could see it incomparably clearly. At this time, after some calculations, he could vaguely guess what was going to happen next. His words did not receive an answer from anyone. If he could see it, the other saints could naturally see it too. For the five worlds, there was only one way to reverse the situation, and that was to gather the power of the four worlds to destroy one of the worlds, and then extract the fragments of the great Tao and integrate it into their own pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. At the same time, they would be able to raise their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures to a level where they could transcend the shackles of the world. Only then would they be able to have some chance of victory in the face of these 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and the situation of that world at this time. Among the five worlds, another world suddenly shook, transforming into a stream of light that rapidly rushed outwards. As expected, Luo Fan sighed, but he could see it with a single glance. That world was clearly the one with the fewest number of saints among the five worlds, with only 7 saints. Just as that world transformed into a stream of light and rushed outwards, for streams of light suddenly shot out from the remaining 4 worlds. Among them, there was an inexhaustible amount of light and shadows that formed 4 mysterious ropes that directly wrapped around the stream of light formed by that world. In an instant, that stream of light had already transformed back into the shape of a spherical world that looked like it was locked in chains. It was obvious. That world knew that it would be treated as a sacrifice by the other 4 worlds. In a situation where it did not want to sacrifice itself, it chose to flee at the first moment. That world did not want to sacrifice itself. This was almost certain. The reason why the five worlds were able to unite to deal with the Genesis Saints world was not because they had deep feelings for each other, but for self-preservation. This was because the Genesis Saint and the others were simply too powerful, so they had no choice but to band together. In such a situation, it could be said that they did not trust each other very much. To sacrifice others, they would not hesitate at all. However, it was impossible for them to sacrifice themselves as a result. The situation was very clear. Running away was also a matter of course. "Let's do it," the Genesis Saint lightly said. As he spoke, his pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure pointed straight at one of the four worlds and suddenly blasted downwards. After cooperating for so long, there was naturally no need to doubt this bit of tacit understanding. Soon, everyone chose their own targets and blasted their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures towards a certain world. Among them, they deliberately let go of the world that was besieged by the other four worlds. The pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures attack method was naturally mysterious. In the void, it was unknown how many billions of strange rays of light appeared in the blink of an eye. These strange rays of light were extremely mysterious, and some of them even evolved into countless worlds. These countless worlds either contained countless scenes of annihilation, destruction, or all sorts of strange things. They blotted out the heavens and covered the four worlds. Under the shroud of these rays of light, phantoms of saints erupted from the four worlds. These phantoms of saints could not exist outside of the world, but they could project their power onto the surface of the world, able to resist all attacks that wanted to attack those worlds. The phantoms of these saints all had calm expressions. They did not look at all like losers who had reached the end of the road and had no choice but to attack their allies. Instead, they looked like ordinary people who were just enjoying the scenery, as if nothing had happened. After their phantoms appeared on the surface of the world, they directly spread out an indescribable light. The light intertwined with each other, forming an incomparably dense defensive brilliance that collided with the power of the 20 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. In an instant, the fluctuations of saint-level power exploded and swept in all directions. In the blink of an eye, countless worlds have been shattered, and even countless fragments of worlds have been turned into nothingness, leaving nothing behind. In just an instant, the number of worlds that had perished was already equivalent to thousands of years for them. But to other living beings, it was only the number of worlds that had been destroyed in a few days. After all, they were saints. Although they had fallen into a disadvantageous position, they were not as fragile as tofu. Therefore, it was obvious that the four worlds had blocked the first wave of attacks. Of course, it was not completely blocked, but a lot of power had affected the interior of those worlds, causing 1,000th of the originally peaceful living beings to be instantly destroyed. As a result, a small half of the countless major worlds, medium worlds, and minor worlds that originally existed were damaged, big or small. At this moment, the mood of the end of the world finally began to spread among all living beings. However, even though they had suffered such losses, even though they had withstood such a powerful attack, they still did not turn their target to Luo Fan and the others. Their real target had always been the same, which was the world that had originally belonged to them. At this time, the world that had become their prey. While enduring the attacks, their attacks were completely focused on that part of the world, constantly bombarding the defensive layer on the surface of that part of the world. They continuously disintegrated the power of the seven saints in that world. Perhaps it was because the saints of the other four worlds had a deep understanding of that world after setting up the formation together over the years, so their attacks seemed to be extremely smooth. That world's resistance to their power was extremely disadvantageous. The damage that had appeared in that world was even more serious than the damage that had appeared in the four worlds. At this moment, the shadows of the seven saints appeared on the surface of the world that had been besieged by the four worlds. Although they had been betrayed and attacked by their original companions, the seven saints did not have any resentment on their faces. Their expressions were still calm. Their eyes were still filled with wisdom. If there was anything different, it would be the flames of unwillingness in the depths of their eyes. The wisdom of the saints was outstanding, and there were very few things that they could not understand. The mentality of the other saints. Naturally, they understood it quite well. In fact, they even believed that if they were in the position of the other worlds, they would definitely make the same choice. But who told them to be the weakest among the five worlds, and also the easiest to deal with? Although this battle was very big and looked extremely tragic, it was still a huge battle. But it did not have much technical content. It looked as if 21 burly men were surrounding 4 burly men and beating them up. But those 4 burly men completely ignored them, and instead grabbed another burly man and began to beat him up. What art of war, what strategy, and what decisiveness, they could not see the slightest bit. If it were not for the fact that their attacks all contained the mysteries of the saint level, this would not look much different from a brawl between gangsters. The understanding of the 4 worlds towards the remaining world was really too deep. It was so deep that it made people suspect that they had been preparing for this situation from the very beginning, from the moment they formed their formation. They had already planned to use the fastest speed to destroy it at this time. Therefore, very quickly, the power of the 5 worlds had already blasted into that world, directly peeling it apart layer by layer. Countless major kiliocosms, medium kiliocosms, and minor kiliocosms were completely destroyed, and the main body of that world completely collapsed. Finally, the great Tao of that world was exposed. And at this time, the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures of the Saint of Genesis, Luo Fan, and the others had not yet shattered the remaining 4 worlds. Instead, they had only destroyed most of the worlds attached to those worlds, causing considerable damage to the main body of that world. They had not even managed to expose the mysterious world. However, at this time, there was no need for anyone to speak. All of them instantly changed their target, directly treating the exposed Great Tao as their target. All the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures instantly blasted towards that Great Tao. The Great Tao was revealed, so although that area was already outside the world, it had the characteristics of inside the world. This allowed the pseudo-saints of that world to already have the power of a saint there, and also allowed their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to also have the power of a primordial origin spiritual treasure. At this moment, the figures of 7 pseudo-saints appeared beside the Great Tao, and beside each of them floated a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure that exuded an eternal, indestructible, and omnipotent aura. Even at this time, these saints still had calm expressions, and they did not show any signs of losing their composure because the situation had almost developed to the end of the line. At this time, the damage that the Saint of Genesis and the others had caused to the 4 worlds had naturally been reduced. This seemed to have already released the pressure on the 4 worlds, giving them a chance to escape. However, at this time, none of the 4 worlds chose to escape. Chapter 1489. The 4 worlds could naturally choose to leave. This kind of choice could also allow them to walk a certain path. However, the many saints were not stupid. They naturally knew that if the balance of power did not change, even if they were to escape now, they would definitely fall under a flying sword in the end. In the end, they would be cut down by that flying sword one by one, and their own Great Tao would become the growth resources of that world. This was already the best proof that the formation formed by the combination of their 5 worlds could not escape from that flying sword. Therefore, for the 4 worlds, the only feasible choice was to first think of a way to increase their own strength. Only by increasing their strength, allowing them to truly obtain the strength to contend with a world that had turned into a flying sword, would they be able to protect themselves under the pressure of this world and obtain true safety. Therefore, at this time, the choice of the 4 worlds was like this. Just now, it was completely aimed at that side that had already been destroyed, with only the Great Tao left. Although the saints in the 4 worlds were unable to make their own saint treasures, which were pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures, transcend the shackles of the world and be able to break away from the world and display the power of the world. However, after their own world had been refined by them, it was already equivalent to a pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasure. In this way, it allowed them to participate in the competition for the Great Tao this time. The choice of the saints at this time was not to completely maintain the Great Tao, but to perfectly maintain it. But even if they could not perfectly maintain it, even if it was destroyed, they would not feel the slightest bit of pity. In this way, when they fought, they naturally had fewer scruples. With fewer scruples, the display of strength was naturally powerful to a terrifying extent. Very quickly, the 7 saints who were resisting the saints were already at a disadvantage. Even though they could already use pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures, in the face of 20 pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures and 5 worlds that were equivalent to primal origin spiritual treasures, they were still far from being able to do so. Very quickly, the pseudo-primal origin spiritual treasures of the 7 saints were destroyed one by one, and the bodies of the 7 saints were destroyed again and again. After destruction, they were destroyed again and again. If they were not the saints of that world, even if they were completely destroyed, they could instantly be reborn from that great Tao. Perhaps they would have already died countless times. However, even so, in this constant process of death and rebirth, what they could do, they were also slowly reaching their limits. It was the Great Way. It had already gradually become dim. As for their defenses, they were gradually revealing flaws. Finally, at a certain moment, the Genesis sage seized this opportunity and used his pseudo-primordial spirit treasure to pierce through the defenses of the 7 sages, directly bombarding the exposed Great Tao. An invisible fluctuation flashed. Where the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure touched the Great Tao, it began to emit endless and terrifying fluctuations. The ripples were so powerful that there were even endless light silhouettes in the void. It looked like a world that was even vaster than before, enveloping the surrounding tens of millions of square kilometers. Soon after, the ripples shattered, and the world formed by the ripples also collapsed, completely disappearing without a trace. Countless fragments of the Great Path splashed everywhere and began to rush into the depths of the void. As the Great Tao collapsed, the bodies of the 7 sages standing in front of the sages trembled. In the blink of an eye, their cultivation levels dropped and they fell from the sage seats. In the blink of an eye, he had already become a supreme being. After becoming a supreme being, how could they still remain unscathed under the impact of the Great Tao shattering and the fluctuations of the many pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures? However, it seemed like they had been crushed by the various fluctuations in the blink of an eye. Everything that belonged to them disappeared in an instant, as if they had never existed. At the same time, the many pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures were like sharks that smelled blood. They began to frantically pounce on the Great Tao fragments that were produced after the Great Tao shattered. These Great Tao fragments were even more thoroughly shattered than the Great Tao fragments that Luo Fan and the others had encountered for the first time. The number had also reached an unbelievable level. As a result, the competition between the many pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures became even more intense. Almost in a flash, the endless Great Tao fragments had already been collected by the 4 worlds and the 20 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. Compared to Luo Fan and the others previously, the sages that belonged to the 4 worlds and couldn't leave the world were at a greater disadvantage this time. Previously, because the Great Tao was outside, the Boulder Saint could still send his Fall Saint ability out of the world and rely on the Great Tao to collect those Great Tao fragments. Now, the sages of the 4 worlds were only afraid that their Great Tao was not hidden enough. How could they expose it outside the world? Since they couldn't expose it outside the world, these sages naturally couldn't send out their Fall Saint abilities, nor could they use their own abilities to collect those Great Tao fragments. As a result, they could only rely on the power of the world itself to collect those Great Tao fragments. In the end, after collecting them into the world, they would slowly distribute them. As a result, after all the fragments were collected, each of the 30 sages in the four worlds only received about 10% of the fragments that Luo Fan and the others had collected. However, even so, the sages were already overjoyed at this moment. Although there were relatively few Great Tao fragments, they were still Great Tao fragments after all. It was enough for their pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures to transform, allowing them to display some of the power of the world outside the world. Although due to the lack of Great Tao fragments, the power that they could display outside the world was still much weaker than the true pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures, or rather, the power that they could display in their own world. However, this was already the difference between zero and non-zero, and it was enough to change their situation. At this extremely dangerous moment, these sages naturally didn't dare to waste any time. After obtaining those Great Tao fragments, they frantically accelerated the flow of time in their own world, using the fastest speed to transform their natal magic treasures, which were the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. As a result, practically at the same time that the fragments of the Grand Tao were split up, there were lumps of powerful light that were eternal and indestructible, constantly being separated from the world. It was the light of pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. There was not a single ball of light. This meant that there was a pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure that transcended the shackles of the world and could display its power outside the world. These rays of light were suspended in the void. They surrounded the world in all directions. Every ball of light. During this process, the aura that they emitted contained a strong sense of defense and vigilance. At the same time, on Luo Fan's side, they had already integrated the Great Tao fragments that they had obtained into their pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures, piece by piece, compared to the world in all directions. The mysteries of the Great Tao contained in the Great Tao fragments were mysterious and unfathomable. Integrating them into the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures could greatly enhance their power. Moreover, because they were pure Great Tao fragments, after they were integrated, they would naturally harmonize, naturally change, and finally completely integrate into one. In this way, even if they were Great Tao fragments from different worlds, after they were completely integrated into the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures, the power of the magic treasures would not be affected at all because of the heterogeneity. Instead, the power of the magic treasures would be increased by how much they were integrated at this moment, after they had integrated the Great Tao fragments into their pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. The auras of those magic treasures had all taken a step forward. Even if it was Luo Fan's heavenly cauldron of the divine court, it could still suppress everything in the void at this moment. Within the scope of its power, it was absolutely invincible and absolutely impossible to resist. This kind of power was clearly even greater than the 30 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures that had emerged from the world in all directions. As soon as they appeared, they formed a strange domain in the void, faintly enveloping the world in all directions, and the 30 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. This void also completely rejected everything, causing the worlds that originally existed here, the few worlds that hadn't been destroyed in their previous battles, to be involuntarily pushed away by this rejection, far away from this area. The scene was thus in a stalemate. This stalemate didn't last for long. Soon, the power of the 30-plus pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures suddenly erupted. They emitted an inexhaustible and everlasting light that could not be worn down by a myriad of tribulations. They condensed together, creating space and time in the void, creating laws, and even faintly forming a Great Tao with these magic treasures as the core. This light formed a world of treasure light. This world of light enveloped the world in all directions. It was filled with endless defense, as well as the faintly brewing, terrifying annihilation. After this world of light condensed, it suddenly rushed towards the encirclement formed by the 20 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. The direction it chose just happened to be the direction of the divine court heavenly cauldron. In other words, it was the direction where Luo Fan's pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures were. The exposed world began to move, but before it came into contact with the divine court heavenly cauldron, Luo Fan already felt the terrifying power contained within it. In that instant, he felt like he had turned into an ordinary person and was facing a 10,000-foot wide iron ball that was rolling towards him from a mountain. The intense pressure and the premonition that he couldn't resist at all made him realize in an instant. This world of treasured light wasn't something he could resist. After understanding this, how could he be in the mood to use the divine court heavenly cauldron to test his premonition? With a thought, his divine court heavenly cauldron flashed and disappeared in front of the world of light, directly opening up the path. However, even so, it wasn't an easy task to escape from the treasured light world. The pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures of the Genesis sage and the others instantly flashed with countless mysterious and inextinguishable lights, transforming into all kinds of special forms. In a flash, they had already wrapped around the world of light, penetrating deep into the world of light and blasting towards the surrounding world. However, as soon as these lights entered the world of light, the destructive power that was brewing in the world of light erupted with a loud bang. Together with the world of light itself, it completely destroyed the powerful lights emitted by the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures. The moment the world of light was destroyed, the more than 30 pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasures around the surrounding world of light once again erupted with boundless treasure light. Once again, they weaved and condensed a world of light. They appeared around the surrounding world of light and formed an extremely powerful world. Then, with a speed that wasn't any slower than before, it flew off into the distance. This time, the Genesis sage and the others didn't stop it anymore, because they already knew. After obtaining so many fragments of the great Tao, the surrounding world already had the strength to stop them. Under such circumstances, if they insisted on attacking the surrounding world of light, it was indeed possible to forcefully leave the surrounding world of light behind. However, the gains wouldn't make up for the losses. Not only would they have to pay a huge price, but they would also likely suffer severe injuries. Moreover, there was a high chance that they would fail. Clearly, if they were to fail at the cost of suffering damage, the final outcome would be fatal to them. At this time, the myriad of worlds had already fallen into true chaos. The surroundings were filled with covetous gazes, and the worlds with saints were casting greedy and prying gazes at them. At this time, they naturally didn't dare to move due to their powerful strength. However, if they were to suffer injuries, the other party wouldn't be polite at all. After participating in the destruction of the world twice, they couldn't be more clear about the consequences of becoming prey. Everyone will have to rest for a while, the Genesis sage said after seeing that the surrounding world had completely escaped from their sight. That's how it should be. Everyone naturally agreed in unison. At this moment, the situation in the myriad of worlds had gradually stabilized. The worlds with saints that were able to survive until now had generally already won once and obtained the fragments of the great Tao. They had raised their saint treasures to a level that could surpass the shackles of the world. In other words, the worlds that could be their targets now had strength similar to theirs. Under such circumstances, it was clearly not a good time to make a move. Their best choice was to wait and wait for the situation to change. Or, to put it another way, what they needed was to be like those sages who were spying on them now. They needed to cast their spying eyes on the various worlds to see which places would have wars between the heavens and earth. Then, they would take the opportunity to join in and pick the fruits since they had reached a consensus. The flying sword naturally floated in the void and gradually fell silent. As it fell silent, the powerful attractive force of a world with a saint was naturally produced. Worlds were attracted by this attractive force and gathered towards this place from all directions. Gradually, it began to form a starry sky around this world. Of course, although the speed was fast, it It was only fast on a macroscopic scale. For ordinary living beings, this speed was an extremely slow process no matter how one looked at it. Therefore, in a short period of time, the speed at which the specks of light appeared in the surroundings was rather slow. It was as if they would only appear after a long, long time. However, once these worlds appeared here, they would naturally be affected by the light emitted by this world. The great Tao within them would also naturally be affected and gradually undergo subtle changes. In that world, Luo Fan and the others began to enter a state of cultivation. Obtaining the great Tao of two completely different worlds was a huge gain even for a false saint. Comprehending the mysteries within would be quite beneficial to their cultivation. After they entered a state of cultivation, the world also fell into an inexplicable calm. Of course, this referred to the saint level. For the false saint level, the supreme venerable level, and the quasi-saint level cultivators, it was naturally impossible for peace to appear. This was especially so when the world itself was undergoing subtle changes. The many worlds that were connected to the world around it were also undergoing changes. This kind of peace was naturally even more impossible to happen. Time passed by slowly. In the blink of an eye, several months had passed. On this day, a ray of spiritual light suddenly came from the sky. It directly collided with the flying sword, causing a layer of subtle ripples to appear on the surface of the flying sword. This is a ray of spiritual light that has fused with the great Tao fragment. Luo Fan was currently on the fulcrum of this world, so he was naturally extremely sensitive to the changes in this world. However, he instantly knew what was going on. That ray of spiritual light seemed ordinary, but it actually contained the great Tao fragment within it. Although there were very few great Tao fragments, there were great Tao fragments after all. How precious they were. They almost surpassed all substances below the saint level, including the holy will. I wonder which saint is so extravagant. The saint of Genesis sighed and raised his hand. In an instant, the spiritual light had already passed through the flying sword, which was also the barrier of this world. It fell into his hands. This change, although Luo Fan did not see it with his own eyes, through the fulcrum of this world, he could still clearly feel it. His heart skipped a beat. In an instant, a large area around his body suddenly turned into a strange state similar to a state of chaos. Subsequently, he discovered that one saint after another appeared in this strange state, including the saint of Genesis who had guided the spiritual light over. It was clear that all the saints had constructed that strange state at the same time where they were. Once this state appeared, they would naturally contact each other to see the other saints. After waiting for all the saints to arrive, the saint of Genesis said, "This is a message from a saint. Fellow Taoists, please take a look with me." As he said that, he raised his hand and waved it. The spiritual light in his hand suddenly fell into a strange state. In an instant, the great Tao fragment within it naturally changed the scene around the spiritual light. Naturally, it had already formed a light shadow, which condensed into a figure. It was the figure of a middle-aged man. This middle-aged man had an aura that only a saint would have. His eyes also contained profound wisdom, as well as indifference that was almost unique to a saint. After the figure of this saint appeared, he slightly bowed to everyone and said, "Yang Ji greets fellow Taoists. This message is to invite you to participate in the meeting of all saints. If you're interested, please come and participate in 3 days." After saying this, the voice shook slightly and disappeared without a trace. Following that, the spiritual light also completely collapsed and eventually disappeared without a trace. Saint Yang Ji did not say where the meeting of all saints would be held. He only said the time. Obviously, he thought that as long as one was a saint, one would easily know where the location was. After the figure disappeared, the saint of Genesis asked indifferently, "What do you all think?" This was actually nonsense. As the name suggested, the meeting of all saints was a meeting where countless saints from all over the universe gathered together. No matter what the topic of this meeting was, no matter what the final outcome of this meeting was, not participating was equivalent to being directly excluded from the circle of saints. Clearly, that was not a wise choice. Therefore, the saints naturally did not have any objections. Even Luo Fan, although he did not completely belong to this world, did not express any different opinions. After reaching a consensus, the saints immediately made their own preparations. In the past, false saints did not have a pseudo-origin spiritual treasure that could transcend the shackles of heaven and earth. They were bound by heaven and earth, and this kind of meeting between saints would obviously not happen. However, the situation was naturally different now. After this change, they could easily use the power of the pseudo-origin spiritual treasure to project their own projections and incarnations to somewhere outside of heaven and earth to meet other saints. This naturally made this kind of meeting between saints possible. Using the power of the pseudo-origin spiritual treasure to condense projections and incarnations was a simple matter for the pseudo-origin spiritual treasure. Chapter 1490. Seeing this, Lin Feng sneered, "All right, Ningquan, you're at the end of your rope now. You're no longer the high and mighty CEO of the Shangtian Corporation. No one will listen to you anymore. I advise you to surrender and fight for leniency. You have to know that your backer, Luo Yong, has fallen. No one can save you now." "Ha!" Seeing that he was deserted, Ning Quan laughed crazily. "Don't be too proud. Don't think that you can step on me just because I'm down. I'm telling you, I won't sit still and wait for death." As soon as he finished speaking, Ning Quan suddenly took out a black pistol from his pocket. Seeing this scene, everyone was stunned by Ning Quan's actions. After all, no one expected Ning Quan to have a gun and carry it with him at all times. Although the law clearly forbade private ownership of guns, many rich people in the country had the habit of collecting guns at home. Lu Tianming immediately reacted and asked loudly, "Ning Quan, what are you doing?" "Hee." Ning Quan sneered. "What am I doing? Mayor Lu, my crimes are too serious. Whether it's bribery or money laundering, they're enough to sentence me to death. If I'm arrested now, I won't be able to escape death. Since that's the case, why should I surrender? Why don't I fight to the death now? Maybe I'll have a chance to live. Don't move. Put the gun down." Seeing that Ning Quan dared to take out his gun in public, the fat policeman also took out his gun and shouted at him. Ning Quan was disdainful of the fat policeman's shout. Don't be fooled by the fact that the police looked mighty in real life. They could only bully ordinary people. Soon, the police who heard the noise immediately surrounded Ning Quan. No matter what, this was the Public Security Bureau. So, more than a dozen police officers immediately came up and pointed their guns at Ning Quan. Lin Feng's face turned pale. "Ning Quan, stop resisting. Don't try to resist, or you'll die." "Hee." Ning Quan chuckled. "Secretary Lin, don't say these words to me. I've been in the business for so many years and have long disregarded life and death. As long as you let me go, I'll put down my gun. If you insist on taking me away, then I won't hesitate to die with you." Lin Feng said, "Ning Quan, even if I let you go, you still have to pay the price. Do you really think you can leave? It's none of your business whether I can leave or not. I only have one question for you. Are you going to let me go or not?" At this moment, Ning Quan had completely gone crazy. He pointed the gun in his hand at Lin Feng and roared. Yang Chuan and the others did not expect things to turn out this way. In the end, Ning Quan actually took out a gun and fought back. Lu Tianming looked at the policeman and shouted, "What are you waiting for? Hurry and protect Secretary Lin." Yes. Hearing this, all the policemen stood in front of Lin Feng. Seeing the sudden change in the situation, Ning Quan's face revealed a trace of ruthlessness. Taking advantage of the fact that no one was paying attention, he suddenly charged towards Sun Feifei, Su Haiyan, and Lan Bingyan. No one thought that Ning Quan would dare to take hostages when surrounded by so many police officers. Caught off guard, Su Haiyan's head was grabbed by Ning Quan's arm, and then he pointed the gun at her head. Yang Chuan, who was at the side, did not expect Ning Quan to be so crazy. Therefore, he did not react for a moment. Su Haiyan, who was being held hostage, looked at Yang Chuan with a crying face and said, "Little Chuan, you have to save me." Seeing that Su Haiyan was being held hostage, Yang Chuan's face immediately became gloomy. He nodded forcefully and said, "Don't worry, Sister Haiyan, I will definitely save you." Hearing this, Su Haiyan nodded and said, "Yes, yes. Little Chuan, I believe you." "Brat, don't talk big. How are you going to save her?" Ning Quan pointed the gun at Su Haiyan's head and stared at Lin Feng and Lu Tianming, saying, "Both of you, get all the policemen out of the way immediately. Otherwise, I will shoot her dead." Lin Feng and Lu Tianming did not expect things to turn out like this. Facing Ning Quan, who had a hostage in his hand, the two of them did not dare to act blindly without thinking. Otherwise, a mad dog like Ning Quan could do anything if he was forced into a corner. "All of you, get out of the way." Lin Feng waved his hand helplessly. Hearing the order, the policemen who surrounded Ning Quan stepped aside to make way. Seeing that all the policemen had made a path for him, the corner of Ning Quan's mouth revealed a trace of success. At this moment, Yang Chuan, who had been looking for a chance to save Ning Quan, suddenly acted. He pulled up Ningbo, who had fainted on the ground, and shouted, "Ning Quan, let go of Sister Haiyan. Otherwise, I will kill your son." "Huh?" Seeing that Yang Chuan was actually holding Ningbo hostage, everyone was completely confused. What had happened today? First, Yang Chuan was arrested, then Kai Jiong was arrested, and now they had to pull out their guns. Seeing that his son was being held hostage by Yang Chuan, Ning Quan immediately shouted angrily, "Yang Chuan, let go of my son." "Oof." Yang Chuan snorted and said, "I can let go of your son, but only if you let go of Sister Haiyan." Facing Yang Chuan's request, Ning Quan's expression was currently hesitant. One must know that Su Haiyan was the only protective talisman in his hands. If he lost her, he would be arrested by the police. Once arrested, he would definitely be sentenced to death after losing his backer. However, Yang Chuan was holding his only son. He really had no choice but to save him. "Nonsense." Lu Tianming's face was livid. "Yang Chuan, let go of Ningbo now." Yang Chuan stubbornly said, "No, I want to save Sister Haiyan. You're really mischievous." Lu Tianming said angrily, "You idiot. It's also illegal for you to hold Ningbo hostage. If you break the law because you want to save a hostage, let me ask you, what's the use even if you save her?" Hearing Lu Tianming's words, Yang Chuan was also stunned. Just now, his brain was really muddled. He didn't think that holding Ningbo hostage was also illegal. Seeing this situation, Lan Bingyun, Hao Jian, and the others all started to persuade him. "Yang Chuan, put her down now." Helpless, Yang Chuan could only gloomily throw the unconscious Ningbo back to the ground like a dead dog. Looking at Yang Chuan, Ning Quan smiled proudly and said, "Kid, you're still no match for me in a fight." Then, Ning Quan held Su Haiyan hostage and walked out of the Public Security Bureau. Everyone followed him out. It was also at this moment that a small helicopter suddenly flew in the sky. Seeing the helicopter, Ning Quan laughed happily and said, "Ha, I'm not going to talk nonsense with you guys anymore. My plane has arrived. After I leave by plane, I can go directly to Canada. By then, I can still live a free and easy life." Hearing Ning Quan's words, everyone's face became very ugly, because no one thought that Ning Quan would actually call a helicopter to pick them up. This was too out of everyone's expectations. At this critical moment, Celestial Master Zhang suddenly chanted an incantation. "Heavenly Spirit, Earthly Spirit, Taishang Laojuan's urgent command, Lightning Talisman." Boom! A bolt of lightning struck Ning Quan. Ning Quan, who had already been struck by lightning before, was struck again. Therefore, he immediately fainted. Chapter 1491. On the other hand, the Genesis Saint and the others had made it clear that they did not agree to contribute their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to other pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. After they returned to this world, they began to closely link their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures together. The power of the 20 pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures interacted with each other, covering their world with an incomparably powerful and stable rainproof barrier. This layer of rainproof barrier stuck closely to the flying sword, even concealing the light of the flying sword. It even isolated this flying sword, which was the attractive force of this world, from the many great thousand worlds around it, causing the great thousand worlds that were approaching this world to gradually stop the transformation process. Although the suction force had disappeared, the great thousand world was already here, and there wasn't any other suction force that could attract them. So they naturally wouldn't move so easily. This caused these great thousand worlds to stop at their current positions. During this entire process, the Saints did not have much communication. If Luo Fan could see that the upcoming war will be even more chaotic, they could naturally see it as well. At this time, it was obvious what choice they should make. After using the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to completely defend this world, the Saints returned to their original calmness. It was as if nothing had happened, and they were still quietly cultivating on the various fulcrums of this world. It was as if nothing had happened. After an unknown period of time, a terrifying fluctuation came from the void. It was the fluctuation that erupted from the battle between the Saints. The influence and power of this fluctuation shocked Luo Fan. The two sides of the battle must have possessed the ability to transcend the shackles of this world. A pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure that could fully display its power outside this world. Just this wave of fluctuation was enough to completely destroy tens of millions of great thousand worlds and the endless living beings that existed within them. This fluctuation was like a switch. After that, waves after waves of movements came from the void. These fluctuations, they were also fluctuations produced by the battle between the Saints. These fluctuations interweaved together. It was as if the myriad worlds began to shake. What do you guys think? The Genesis sage asked calmly. Although he was hundreds of millions of light years away from everyone else, all the Saints, including Luo Fan, heard his words immediately. She also understood what he meant. However, Luo Fan knew that these words were directed at him. What the Genesis sage said. He was asking the Saints if they should participate in the ongoing war. There was no doubt about this for the other Saints. In this situation, it was obvious that the Saints who wanted to fuse the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure had already begun to act against those who opposed, and they were also opponents. It was impossible for them to stay out of this matter. It's not just because they're on the same side as the sages who are being attacked. Was it because they were natural allies? Or was it because if they did not do anything now, the sages who supported them would win? Then, it would be their turn next. This was a process where the lips were gone and the teeth were interdependent. Therefore, for these sages, participating in a war was obviously a matter of course. There was no doubt about it. In this world, the only person who could possibly object to participating in the war was obviously Luo Fan. Because, these days, Luo Fan had been planning to leave. Be it the Genesis sage or the other sages, everyone knew this very well. When the Genesis sage said those words, although the other sages did not have much of a reaction, Luo Fan could vaguely feel that their attention was on him. Feeling the attention of the sages, Luo Fan smiled bitterly to himself. Originally, he had in mind the idea of taking advantage of the situation to leave was gradually dispelled. If he left now, there was a high chance that he could escape and return to the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, where he was preparing to face the sixth great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, if he did that, it might cause his world to fall into an unnecessary danger. Although the sages did not have the same concept as Luo Fan and could not detect the existence of the gap between the state of chaos and heaven and earth, they could not find the location of his world. However, this did not mean that they could not enter Luo Fan's world. Just like Luo Fan, he had traveled from the Earth universe to the primordial world and then returned to the Earth universe from the primordial world through some special methods. During this process, he did not personally experience the state of chaos. He did not truly understand the state of chaos. Since he was able to do such an unbelievable thing, even though he was so weak back then, he would not be surprised at all if those false saints could enter his world through some means. The reason why none of the saints had made such an attempt to step into the world in the gap between the heaven and earth and the state of chaos was because they had not found the motivation to do so, nor did they know the existence of that world. If one day they discovered that a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure that they wanted to obtain had disappeared in that world and entered a world that they were completely unfamiliar with or even could not sense under normal circumstances, would they not pay attention to Luo Fan's world? Would they not think of a way to enter that world at all? It was precisely because of this that if Luo Fan chose to retract his incarnation at this time and chose to bring this pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure into his world, he would obviously be looking for trouble for himself. That was obviously looking for trouble for himself. It was practically creating clues that could expose the existence of his world to the saints. After thinking through all of this, Luo Fan sighed. He knew that unless he dealt with all the sages who wanted to collect all the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, he would never be able to take this pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure into his world. After knowing all of this, he naturally made a decision. He immediately said, "Of course, I'll join the battle as soon as possible." Everyone knows the principle of being in the same boat. Hearing this, the sages heaved a sigh of relief. Although Luo Fan was currently only a level 8 pseudo-sage, his strength was only slightly stronger than that of a supreme venerable. Compared to them, who had truly proven their Tao and become saints, there was still a huge gap. However, after he obtained the supreme authority of this world, he already had the strength to be on equal footing with them. After obtaining the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, he had grown to the point where he even had a chance to defeat them. This way, if Luo Fan was unwilling, they would not be able to force him. They could only watch helplessly as he left. They were controlled by this world and shackled by it. Once the world was destroyed, they would naturally be destroyed as well. Luo Fan was different. Although he had the supreme authority of this world and had a power similar to that of a sage in this world. However, he was not a pseudo-sage of this world. His connection with this world was far less close than that of those pseudo-sages. The destruction of this world, although it might cause some damage to him, it would definitely not be fatal. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan was in a bad mood and destroyed this world, then they would undoubtedly die. To completely destroy a world that could give birth to a sage was an almost impossible task for any cultivator below the pseudo-sage level. However, for a powerful existence who possessed the power of a sage and even a pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, there were simply too many ways to do that. Even if there were many sages protecting this world and doing their best to prevent it from being destroyed, it was still impossible to guard against it. No one knew when a small mistake would be seized and the world would be destroyed. It was precisely because of this that even though the sages thought that their combined strength was many times stronger than Luo Fan's, they did not dare to easily deal with Luo Fan or fall out with him. Of course, they would not be able to force Luo Fan. Since Luo Fan had already agreed, the sages naturally did not hesitate anymore. Immediately, they exerted their strength at the fulcrum of the world that they controlled and activated the flying sword to throw it towards the battlefield that was closest to them. In a war between heaven and earth, it was naturally impossible for the world of both sides to remain still. It had to move quickly in the void. As a result, if the flying sword wanted to cross the void to reach that place, it would not be as convenient as it was for Luo Fan and the others to send their avatars to the place where the gathering of the saints was held. Instead, it would have to fly slowly like it was in normal space-time and cross a group of worlds one after another before it could reach that place. Along the way, they seemed to have seen many worlds that could give birth to sages. Although it was an extremely large-scale war. Although the war involved an effort by the sages to turn what was fake into reality. However, not all sages and all the worlds that had sages were prepared to participate in it. Along the way, many worlds that Luo Fan saw were quietly staying on the spot. At most, they gathered the power of various pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures together to protect their worlds. However, they did not participate in the war. nor did they help those sages who wanted to fuse the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures together, or those sages who opposed this practice. Looking at them at the beginning, it was as if all the changes in the universe had nothing to do with them. Luo Fan could see through the thoughts of this world and this kind of saint at a glance. To them, fusing the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures with each other to create an astonishing world for them to prove their Tao again was a state of indifference. In other words, to them, they did not have a strong desire to give up the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures in exchange for that opportunity. They did not think that there was a high chance of success. However, at the same time, they did not reject handing over their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. As long as the situation developed to the point where all the opponents had been killed and all of their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures had been fused together, they would naturally fuse their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures with the many saints who supported this. However, if the situation did not develop to that point, they would naturally stay out of the matter and not help either side of the war. Most of them were the sages who had abstained from expressing their views and did not express their views. Of course, there were also a large number of sages who had opposed the idea. However, compared to those sages who did not express their views, his attitude became slightly more resolute. Although they could accept handing over their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, they would not be like those sages who had abstained and voluntarily hand them over when the time was right. Instead, they would need other sages to force them to submit. This kind of mentality was not difficult to speculate. Whether it was Luo Fan, the Genesis sage, or even the other sages, whether they agreed to fuse the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures or opposed the fusion of these treasures. They were also clear about their mentality and thoughts. Therefore, although they might be closer to the position of these sages, they acted like those sages and treated them as if they did not exist. They only focused on dealing with those extremely stubborn sages, just like the Genesis sage and the others. They would definitely not agree to hand over their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. Very quickly, Luo Fan and the others had already driven the flying sword and directly arrived at the place where the battle fluctuations had erupted from the closest location to their original location. What a coincidence! Luo Fan could not help but sigh when he saw the situation on the battlefield. He was actually extremely familiar with one of the two sides of the battle. It was clearly the Four Directions world that had escaped from their hands. However, at this moment, the Four Directions world was in a state of being besieged. The ones besieging the Four Directions world were also the Four Directions world. Each of the Four Directions world that was besieged was stronger than the Four Directions world that was besieged. This point could not only be seen from the number of sages, but also from the aura that erupted from their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. Compared to the Four Directions world that was besieged by all the sages that had combined a small part of a complete great Tao, each of the Four Directions world that was besieged had personally seized a complete great Tao. The number of great Tao fragments that had been integrated into the magic treasures of each false sage was more than the magic treasures of any of the sages that were besieged. Moreover, it was several times more. Under such circumstances, it was already very obvious how the situation would develop. The side that was besieging had the absolute upper hand. Under their siege, the 30-odd pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and the pills formed by the Four Directions world in the center seemed to be in a rather sorry state. They could only display all kinds of mysterious treasure lights to form a treasure light world, trying their best to resist the attacks of the many pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures in the outside world. The treasure light world would perish together with the power of the magic treasures and then reconstructed. This process was exactly the same as when they had escaped from Luo Fan and the others. However, compared to the time when the Genesis Saint and the others had given up because they felt that the gains would not make up for the losses, the heavens that were besieging them were extremely determined. More than 50 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and the Four Directions world that had also turned into various magic treasures had combined together, which was equivalent to about 60 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that were constantly attacking. Even though their attacks were being countered by the destruction of the treasured light world, They didn't relax at all and continued to attack at all times. I didn't expect that we would have to fight side by side. Luo Fan suddenly felt that the affairs of the world were unpredictable. Originally, they were the culprits who had chased after the four sides of the world, and they had even forced the four sides of the world to attack their own companions. But now, they had become the saviors of the four sides of the world. They actually wanted to help the four sides of the world escape the fate of being besieged, and they even wanted to destroy and devour the four sides of the world that were besieging them. There was no need to say any nonsense. The Genesis Saint and the others naturally chose their target. The 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures suddenly broke away from the flying sword, emitted a treasure light that exuded a strong sage aura, and directly rushed towards the besieging Four Directions world. They directly bombarded the main body of the Four Directions world. The ones controlling the Four Directions world were obviously sages. Since he was a sage, how could he not have sensed that the flying sword was flying toward him without any concealment? At this moment, it was impossible for them not to feel the bombardment of the 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. At this moment, in a flash, the Four Directions world had already hidden in the light protection of the more than 50 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. The pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that Luo Fan and the others control were enough to completely destroy the Four Directions world that could give birth to sages. However, the treasure light blocked the attack in an instant. When the two collided, a terrifying shock wave instantly began to spread out from the point of impact, condensing into countless space-times in the void. Countless worlds were destroyed and disappeared in the blink of an eye. Although the besieged Four Directions world was weaker than any of the Four Directions world present, it was only the Four Directions world itself. It was just that their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures were weaker. However, it did not mean that the wisdom of the sages in the Four Directions world was worse than any of the sages. It did not mean that they did not know how to seize the opportunity. At this moment, they took advantage of this opportunity to directly construct a treasure light world that was 10 times stronger than the original. Not only did it defend against the terrifying sage attack that had blasted towards their bodies, but it also directly devoured the Four Directions world that was besieging them. This kind of attack was linked to the attack that Luo Fan and the others had launched from the outside. Unknowingly, it had formed a situation where the sages who were besieging the Four Directions world had fallen into the worst state. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes flashed, and he found that there were 2 more heavens and earth breaking through the void. From the sage aura that was emitted, Luo Fan instantly knew that these 2 heavens and earth belonged to the sages who had agreed to fuse the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures. With their identities, they had come here at this time. As for what they were here for, it was self-explanatory. At this moment, Luo Fan and the others changed the direction of their attacks at the same time. They changed the attack of the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and shot towards the 2 heavens and earth. At this moment, more than 30 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures suddenly flew out from the 2 heavens and earth. They instantly formed a strange array in the void, turning into an incomparably deep black hole that directly swallowed the 20 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures that Luo Fan and the others had launched. Although the incomparably deep black hole could not withstand this method and collapsed with a loud bang, it had already easily blocked the terrifying attack that Luo Fan and the others had launched. Immediately afterwards, the more than 30 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures once again condensed into a pitch-black and deep black hole and quickly pounced towards Luo Fan and the others. This black hole was naturally different from the black holes in the normal universe. For the black holes in the normal universe, not to mention a false sage, even a quasi-sage could easily crush them with one hand and completely turn them into nothingness. However, this was not the case with the deep and unfathomable black hole in front of them. This kind of black hole was enough to swallow countless vast thousand worlds with just a slight movement. At this moment, almost all of the suction force of this black hole was directed towards Luo Fan and the others, towards their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures, and towards the world that had already condensed into a flying sword. However, just the power that was leaking out was already enough to attract the sparse vast thousand worlds in the surroundings to focus on it. In the blink of an eye, thousands of vast thousand worlds had disappeared. Not even a single bubble had emerged. In the face of such a terrifying attack, the Genesis Saint and the others all had solemn expressions. Compared to the black hole that had completely shattered their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures and even caused them to perish together, this black hole was more than 10 times stronger. Such a fierce collision instantly made their pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures faintly feel as if they were out of control. Even the world that they had already turned into a flying sword seemed to be attracted by the terrifying suction force of the black hole. Their control was somewhat unstable, and it was almost difficult for them to move freely. This kind of dangerous situation was the first time this flying sword had been condensed. Even when they had been besieged by the 5 worlds, they had not felt such a sense of danger. At this moment, suddenly, rays of spiritual light shot out from the depths of the void and directly bombarded the black hole, causing it to instantly collapse, turning into countless tiny and pitch-black fragments. Then, in the void, 3 worlds and more than 60 pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures appeared. It seems that the scale is getting larger and larger. Luo Fan saw everything clearly and at the same time let out a sigh of relief. Chapter 1492. Compared to cultivators who had yet to become sages, the wisdom of sages had already been enhanced in nature. Things like language and communication had already become dispensable to them. Watermark advertisement test things like misunderstandings would almost never exist. This kind of situation would naturally lead to one result. For sages, there would occasionally be some words when they were on the same side, but if they were enemies, there would almost be no words. Just like now, in this void, there were more than 100 sages gathered together in the 14 worlds, but none of them spoke. They were very clear about their position, what they wanted to do, and what they had to guard against. There was no doubt at all. When they attacked, there was no hesitation, and no one tried to use words to shake their opponents. When they cooperated, even if they had never really communicated before, it could be said that there was a tacit understanding between the sages. At this moment, after the shockingly powerful black hole was shattered, Luo Fan and the others directly changed their target of attack and turned to the 4 corners of the world that were besieging the 4 corners of the world. Finally, at the last moment, they changed the direction of their attacks and intercepted the many attacks that were about to suppress the 4 corners of the world in the center, causing the 4 corners of the world to fall into a state of siege once again. As for the 30 or so saints from the 2 worlds that were attacking them, their targets were now the 3 new worlds that had just appeared. The power of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures continuously appeared in this void and collided with other powers, producing an astonishing destructive effect. This made the void seem a little unbearable, and it seemed that an even more profound change was about to take place. It was a confrontation between sage-level powers. Space-time, worlds, living beings, all of these became extremely tiny existences. Practically every single moment, there were countless worlds and worlds being born and destroyed. There were countless mysteries. It was enough for any supreme venerable to work hard for hundreds of trillions of years to obtain it. Hundreds of false sages, hundreds of pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. More than a dozen worlds were engaged in an earth-shattering, chaotic battle here. The strength and terror of the aftermath of the battle were truly indescribable. Originally, during the battle here, the surrounding tens of millions of worlds had already been emptied. Now, the scale of the battle had skyrocketed. The impact of the aftermath of the battle had increased even more, and it was several times stronger than before. This large area of nothingness had been completely emptied, and almost hundreds of millions of worlds have been completely annihilated in the process. There were trillions of living beings in every great thousand world. Hundreds of millions of worlds have been completely annihilated, and the number of living beings that had died was simply shocking. However, even so, the many sages present, including Luo Fan, were not moved by this. Living beings that had not become sages. To them, they could create countless great thousand realms that could not give birth to saints with a single thought. Under such circumstances, how could they be moved by the loss of these great thousand realms? In fact, they might even feel that these worlds had disappeared, clearing their battlefield and clearing it. They would no longer be disturbed by those worlds. Apart from this battlefield, the battles in other parts of nothingness were also in full swing. Almost every battlefield had developed into a large-scale, chaotic battle. Those worlds had gathered from all over and gathered together, erupting with the strongest destructive power they had ever since they were born to fight with other worlds and achieve the goals of those sages in those worlds. In such a battlefield, the combined strength of both sides was about the same. The situation was more or less even. Obviously, the number of sages who approved of the fusion of those pseudo-primordial spiritual treasures to create worlds was about the same as the number of sages who firmly opposed it, or rather, at this time, it seemed to be about the same. If it was an ordinary battlefield, such a stalemate would definitely result in extremely heavy casualties. However, as a saint-level battle, there were no casualties in such a situation. Although some worlds would be damaged, and some sages' magic treasures would be shattered, none of the worlds that truly made them exist had suffered fatal damage. It was not because these worlds were powerful, but because every sage had an incomparably clear understanding of the situation and clearly knew what to do to benefit the war. Every time a part of the world could not withstand it and was about to be shattered and completely destroyed, there would naturally be other saints who would come to their aid and block this fatal blow. Even if this might cause them to suffer a lot of damage, they would still do it. This was because they knew very well that the destruction of any world could be the straw that broke the camel's back for the overall situation. It would completely change the situation of the war and might cause their camp to fall into a dead end. The combat strength of both sides was about the same. In this situation where they supported each other, it was naturally unlikely that a world would be destroyed so easily. This situation was the difference between a saint-level battle and a battle between ordinary cultivators. Between ordinary cultivators, even if they were at the supreme venerable level, because of their different cultivation paths and their differences in wisdom, not everyone could clearly understand the general situation. Even if they understood the general situation, not everyone could take this general situation as the true focus. Instead, the vast majority would let their own selfishness suppress everything and then ignore the general situation. In this way, there was room for stratagems in the war between them, defeating the strong with the weak, or even if they were clearly strong, they would cause unnecessary damage because they did not support each other. This kind of thing was absolutely not uncommon. On Luo Fan's side, the battle between more than a dozen worlds and hundreds of sages was also a saint-level battle. At this moment, the one who suffered the greatest loss was the four worlds with the weakest power. After all, they were a big target and had to bear a lot of siege attacks. It would be extremely troublesome for other worlds to support them. It was very easy to overlook them. At this moment, although the treasure light world formed by the power of the many sages' pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures in the four worlds was mysterious, its power was no longer as strong as it was at the beginning. Almost from time to time, there would be powerful attacks that crossed these treasure light worlds. They would attack the four worlds themselves, causing them or some vast thousand realms to be destroyed. Or some medium thousand realms would be destroyed and suffer considerable damage. Apart from the four worlds that suffered the most damage, the other worlds that participated in the chaotic battle were almost the same. Among each other, no one dared to say that they had suffered the least damage. In the world where Luo Fan was, it was the same. In this world, at this moment, only thousands of vast thousand realms had been lost. Even the main body of this world had not suffered much damage. However, compared to before, when they did not even feel that their world was fighting with others, this time, the living beings in this world were not so lucky. The sky flashed from time to time. The light that contained endless mysteries and the waves of inexplicable mysterious fluctuations were all telling them that this world was erupting with earth-shattering battles with other worlds. Although this world could be attacked by saint-level power, it could be destroyed. Under such circumstances, for all living beings in this world, almost every living being in this world felt a crisis of doomsday in their hearts. Under such circumstances, almost every living being in this world felt a crisis of doomsday in their hearts. Every time this kind of crisis appeared in the past, it would greatly change the situation of this world, causing it to become chaotic. But this time, the situation did not develop like before. There was no other reason. The reason why the world had become chaotic because of the crisis of doomsday was that all living beings had gotten used to peace, stability, and the feeling of the world existing forever. That was why they were unable to maintain their original state of mind when the end of the world was approaching. That was why they were in such a state of chaos. But now, all living beings had gotten used to this sense of crisis. The order that was created by the original chaos and adapted to the crisis of doomsday had been reestablished. Under such circumstances, how could there be any chaos when the end of the world arrived? However, although there was no chaos, it did not mean that the crisis of doomsday did not change the situation of this world. In fact, it was the opposite. Although there was no chaos, the change of the crisis of doomsday was more obvious than the chaos of the past. Due to the crisis of doomsday, the potential of most living beings was stimulated, which led to their realms and greatly improved their strength. In the end, it caused the cultivation civilization of this world to improve again under impossible circumstances. The number of false saints in this world had unknowingly increased by 10%, and the number of demi-saints had more than doubled. As for the Khanate, Grand Luo, and Pure Yang primordial cultivators, the number had increased by dozens or even hundreds of times. This change was both beneficial to all living beings in this world, but also made them feel helpless. In the past, Khanate Grand Luo cultivators were already considered experts, but now they could only be considered as beginners. Not to mention Pure Yang primordial cultivators and the like, they were already everywhere. This change was seen by all the saints. Although they did not show it, Luo Fan knew that they were very happy about this situation. Luo Fan thought to himself, "It's about time for a new saint to appear." The flow of time in this world had already been adjusted to an extremely fast level by the saints. This flow of time could be said to be equivalent to tens of thousands of years passing here in just a few days in other places of the universe on Earth. Therefore, although this world had only participated in this chaotic battle for a few days, the upgrade of the cultivation civilization in this world was almost complete. During this time, there were countless level 9 false saints and supremacy venerables trying to break through to the saint realm. Even the level 9 false saints and supremacy venerables who did not have much confidence in their success had mustered up their courage to break through in this short period of time. For many cultivators in this world, there was only one way to get rid of the crisis of doomsday, and that was to become a saint. For all living beings in this world, their limited knowledge told them that as long as they could become a saint, they would be eternally indestructible and invincible, omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient. It was enough to free them from their current fearful fate. They could control their own fate. It was because of this knowledge that they were so persistent in becoming a saint. The process that was originally supposed to take billions of years to be carried out in this short period of time was shortened to this short period of time. Unfortunately, how could becoming a saint be so simple? Even if they wanted to become a false saint, it was still the same. Therefore, in these years, not only did the world not gain any new sages, but almost 90% of the venerables and level 9 pseudo-sages had their life force completely wiped out because they had failed to prove their Tao. However, although they had all failed, it was not that there were no positive effects. In fact, their Tao proving process had left an extremely valuable experience for this world. However, they had left behind extremely valuable experiences for the world, allowing the future generations to stand on their shoulders to charge into the saint realm, allowing them to avoid unnecessary mistakes. It continuously increased their chances of becoming a saint. In this way, there would definitely be a day when a cultivator successfully proved their Tao and became a saint. It was also because of this consideration that Luo Fan let out such a sigh at this time. The battle continued. Even a battle between ordinary level 9 pseudo-sages could last for trillions of years, let alone a battle between sages of a higher level where they were evenly matched. Of course, it wouldn't be surprising if it took a long time. In the blink of an eye, several months had passed. Of course, this several months was based on the normal time dimension of the Earth's universe. If it was for the saints and the other worlds, it would take countless times longer than this time. At this moment, the stalemate on many battlefields had reached its limit. Although the strength of the two camps was similar, it was impossible for them to be completely equal. The battle during this period of time was enough to magnify the originally small gap between them. During this process, the difference in strength between the two sides, which were originally equal, gradually became clear. In the end, the side that opposed the fusion of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure won the upper hand. In other words, it was Luo Fan's side. This was most clearly reflected in the battlefield that Luo Fan participated in. Amidst the fluctuations of the power of the infinite saints and the light of the countless pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasures, a saint's pseudo-primordial origin spirit treasure suddenly exploded in the center of the 4 heavens and earth. However, under the endless attacks, it couldn't withstand the intense battle. It couldn't withstand the impact of the many saint-level powers and was completely shattered. This pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure was originally in the shape of a vase. It was extremely powerful, able to absorb all and spit out all. Not only could it absorb all attacks, but it could also spit out all attacks that one could imagine, or even unimaginable. The last attack that attacked this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure was actually Luo Fan's divine court heavenly cauldron. At this moment, the pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure exploded, producing trillions of fragments that evolved into innumerable worlds, innumerable heavens and earth, innumerable terrifying and mystical things. At this time, Luo Fan suddenly turned the heavenly furnace of the divine court and crazily swallowed up these fragments. These pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures were equivalent to false saints. They had the eternal and indestructible characteristics of false saints. Normally speaking, even if it was shattered, it would not be a fatal injury. As long as there was enough time, it could naturally condense back into a complete pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure that was no different from the original one. However, that would take time. After being smashed into pieces, although its essence did not fall to the level of supreme venerable artifact, its power had been scattered. After all, how could it still withstand the force that could shatter it when it was still intact? At this moment, under the suction force of the divine court heavenly cauldron that could tear a person and a world into a tiny speck of dust, all the fragments were swallowed into the divine court heavenly cauldron and completely suppressed. Good. After Luo Fan had completely absorbed and swallowed the fragment, the heavenly cauldron of the divine court rotated and instantly retracted, directly dodging the dozen or so sage-level powers that were bombarding him from all directions. These were the forces that were coming to rescue this pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure and to intercept Luo Fan's divine court heavenly cauldron. They were sent by other pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. Unfortunately, because of the obstruction of the Genesis Saints on Luo Fan's side, they could not make it in time. In the end, after Luo Fan had absorbed all the fragments, they had just arrived. Luo Fan directly took back the divine court heavenly cauldron. It rushed into the flying sword and directly appeared in front of him. Although it had already absorbed the fragments of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. However, because of the indestructible nature of the pseudo primordial origin spiritual treasure. The divine court heavenly cauldron had to use all its strength to suppress those fragments, and it was already unable to continue fighting. Anyway, he had already dealt with the other party's pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, which could be considered to have completed the task. Naturally, he directly returned the divine court heavenly cauldron. If he wanted to retreat, the other saints of the four worlds would naturally not agree. As the divine court heavenly cauldron retreated, the power of the saints and all kinds of power that belonged to the saints constantly attacked him. These powers, if any one of them directly crashed into any world, even if it was a world that could give birth to a saint, it was enough to destroy most of the world. Dozens of such attacks attacked Luo Fan's divine court heavenly cauldron at the same time. Even if the divine court heavenly cauldron had integrated more great Tao fragments than the other party, it was still difficult to withstand. If it could not dodge, it was almost certain that it would shatter like the previous bottle. Fortunately, Luo Fan was not fighting alone. It was not only the saints of the beginning who controlled their pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures to attack at the same time to intercept the power of the saints. Even the 30 saints in the four worlds that were besieged and suffered the most damage also attacked. In the end, Luo Fan's divine court heavenly cauldron easily passed through the layers of obstacles and smoothly returned to the world, reappearing in front of him. At this time, Luo Fan had taken back the divine court heavenly cauldron and destroyed the other party's pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. The overall situation did not seem too different from before, and the comparison of power did not seem too obvious. However, this was only on the surface. At this moment, the entire situation had completely changed. Naturally, the saints would not be as short-sighted as ordinary mortals. They clearly knew that although Luo Fan had taken back the divine court heavenly cauldron, they could predict that this was only temporary. Very soon, Luo Fan might return with even greater strength and power. At that time, this balance would be broken in an instant, and their camp would immediately fall into a dead end. With this kind of understanding, how could they still choose to move steadily and surely like before? Of course, they had to change their choice. In the battle, they had to take more risks. Originally, their strength was a little weaker than the other side. This risk naturally caused their situation to become even worse. Almost in the blink of an eye, the situation had clearly tilted. The balance that had been maintained for the past few months was gradually broken. At this time, Luo Fan did not care about how the situation of the battle would develop. At this moment, he had poured all of his strength into the three-legged cauldron in front of him. At this moment, the fragments of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure had been suppressed by him according to the method that every fragment, no matter how small, could open up a world to suppress them. There were hundreds of thousands of fragments, and he had opened up hundreds of thousands of vast thousand domains to suppress them. This was almost impossible for the divine court heavenly cauldron, which had not been upgraded to the level of a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. But for the current divine court heavenly cauldron, this was not a problem at all. As long as Luo Fan transmitted his thoughts into it, it would naturally create these hundreds of thousands of vast thousand domains. Every fragment of a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, no matter how small, had power far beyond that of supreme venerable. It was not that the power contained in them surpassed them, but that their essence far surpassed them. It was the way of the saints contained in them that surpassed them. This was just like the great Tao fragments that could give birth to saints, and the great Tao of a supreme venerable could upgrade a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. But no matter how many fragments there were, the great Tao of the vast thousand domains was useless to the great Tao of a supreme venerable. It was their essence that gave them such power. Chapter 1493. After they were sealed into the vast thousand realms, their power erupted, and they directly changed the entire form of the vast thousand realms, turning the normal vast thousand realms into all sorts of strange states. The creatures born from them also became creatures that were compatible with the fragments of the pseudo primordial spiritual treasure, and finally gave birth to all sorts of incredible civilizations. Even if the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure had been reduced to fragments, it was absolutely not something that an ordinary magic treasure fragment could compare to. The truth and the mysteries contained within it could be described as earth-shattering. For these fragments, Luo Fan controlled the power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court to sweep through the realms one by one. With the terrifying power of the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure, he crushed the magic treasure fragments that surpassed the supreme venerable realm bit by bit and extracted the great Tao fragments contained within them bit by bit. Although this process was smooth, it was extremely complicated. The amount of time and energy required to do so was astonishing. Even if the heavenly cauldron of the divine court could freely adjust the flow of time within it, it would still take a lot of time to complete the entire process and extract all the great Tao fragments. It was impossible to complete it in just a few breaths of time. The sizes of the fragments were not the same, so their power was naturally different. After several days, Luo Fan finally swept through the largest one. It was the vast thousand realms at the bottom of the bottle of the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure. The bottom of the bottle. It was the most important part of the magic treasure. It also contained the most fragments of the great Tao in the entire magic treasure. Its power was obviously. It was also the strongest of the many magic treasure fragments. After a period of time, this fragment had already completely controlled the vast thousand realms. It had completely changed the rules and laws within it, and even completely fused with it. As a result, the vast thousand realms that had originally sealed this magic treasure fragment had become the power of this magic treasure fragment. When Luo Fan controlled the power of the pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure to enter the vast thousand realms, he suddenly felt that vast thousand realms didn't seem like the vast thousand realms created by the heavenly cauldron of the divine court, but more like the vast thousand realms created by this magic treasure fragment. It contained all the laws and laws, all matter, and all space-time. They soaked into the magical treasure fragment's spiritual light and fused together with the magical treasure fragment's spiritual light, forming an extremely mysterious domain that repelled everything, crushed everything, and destroyed everything. When the power of the divine court heaven cauldron entered this terrifying domain, it was crushed crazily and felt an indescribable pressure. In the blink of an eye, it was crushed into pieces. Wow, he's actually so powerful. This is almost a tenth of the power of that pseudo-primordial essence spirit treasure. Luo Fan couldn't help but praise in his heart. Although he did not pay much attention to it, the fragment of the artifact was able to borrow the power of the great thousand world to destroy the heavenly divine cauldron. So it must be powerful enough. Only then would it be able to achieve such a feat. He had truly accomplished such an amazing feat. After secretly praising it, he did not hesitate to increase the amount of power that was pouring into the great thousand world. In an instant, the great thousand world rapidly changed. According to the laws and laws of the great thousand world, time, space, the great Tao, and even everything else, although it was a slow process, it was extremely resolute in changing. After all, this great thousand world was created by the divine court heaven cauldron. In essence, it still had its mark in it. Even if the magical treasure fragment changed it to its most basic form, there would still be traces left in it. These traces were a breakthrough at this time, enough to allow the divine court heaven cauldron's power to reverse the essence of the world. Even the power consumed was much less than the power of the magical treasure fragment itself. Not long after, the entire great thousand world was completely restored to its original appearance. In the boundless void of the universe, stars, nebulae, and river systems filled the void. In this boundless universe, there was a huge, irregular disk that was several light years in diameter, occupying the center of the universe. The entire universe seemed to revolve around this disk. Faintly, there seemed to be layers of restraints on this disk, as if they were restricting the power of this disk, preventing it from exerting its power. This disc was the fragment of the magical treasure. Originally, although it was less than the size of a palm and seemed to be able to be grasped with one hand, that was not its true size, nor was it its true appearance. It was because the wonderful structure of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure had restrained its changes, allowing it to maintain a form that was most suitable for a sage to grasp. But now, without the restraint of the wonderful structure of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure, this magical treasure fragment naturally had no power that could stop it. It could shackle it, and its true size was naturally revealed. This was also the common behavior of many magical treasure fragments after they were sealed into the Great Thousand World. Every fragment, no matter how small it was, became astonishingly huge. Luo Fan sensed the bottom of the bottle and frowned. He suddenly found that the bottom of the bottle was a little strange. It seemed that it was not as simple as a fragment of the pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. It seemed that there was a deeper secret contained within, with a thought, the power of the heavenly cauldron of divine court condensed, and his figure appeared in this great thousand world. This was an existence similar to the projection that he had created when he participated in the meeting of all saints. Although it was impossible for him to perfectly exert his strength, it was enough to make him invincible under the sage realm. Of course, this was the power of the projection itself. Inside the heavenly cauldron of divine court, he could naturally easily use all the power of the heavenly cauldron and exert all his strength. After condensing this projection, Luo Fan took a step forward, and his figure had already arrived on the magical treasure fragment. The surface of this magical treasure fragment was densely engraved with countless fine lines that were like dust, and within each line, there was no telling how many fine lines there were. Within each fine line, there were also countless lines. In this way, the lines continued to circulate deeper and deeper, and the number was almost infinite. The profound and unfathomable way of the sage was contained within these endless lines. With a single glance, Luo Fan knew that there were many mysteries within. This was what an ordinary pseudo-primordial spiritual treasure should have. Obviously, the strangeness he had felt earlier did not come from this. Apart from the endless lines on the surface that could not even be seen at a glance. Inside the bottom of the bottle, which was the part that could be seen above the fracture, were not lines. Instead, it looked like a material that did not exist between heaven and earth, and could not be described with words. Even for Luo Fan, this material could not be seen at a glance. At a glance, it was impossible to tell how many materials were fused and refined, let alone know how they were smelted. However, this was also very normal. The many fragments that he had dealt with before were all made of the same material, and this was not the source of strangeness. Suddenly, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat, and he grasped that strange feeling. His eyes lit up, and he said softly, "Spiritual intelligence?" As he said this, he suddenly raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. The power of the heavenly cauldron of the divine court endlessly gathered between his hands, and under his control, he suddenly grabbed the bottom of the bottle below, just as he made a grabbing motion. Previously, it did not move at all, like a dead object, like an extremely ordinary, bottom-sized magic treasure fragment, but it began to shake violently. Boundless spiritual light shone from the magic treasure fragment. Then, a Tao that contained endless mysteries appeared, without beginning and without end. Even the great Tao that contained traces of the essence of a sage suddenly rushed out from it. This great Tao was extremely complete. There was not a trace of it being broken, and it looked like the great Tao of heaven and earth that could give birth to a sage had directly appeared. It has actually evolved and completed again. It seems that there is indeed spiritual intelligence in it. Luo Fan said with a faint smile. This great Tao obviously could not be the real great Tao. The reason why it appeared like this and seemed to have become extremely complete was obviously because the great Tao fragments that originally existed at the bottom of the bottle had naturally evolved and transformed after they gathered together once more. In the end, this great Tao had evolved completely, and that was why it appeared like this. Of course, although this great Tao had evolved into a complete appearance, it was only on the surface. Its essence was still the condensation of so many great Tao fragments, but it would not really become the great Tao of heaven and earth that could give birth to a sage. Compared to that great Tao, although the essence of this great Tao was not much different, it was still much weaker in terms of quantity. As Luo Fan spoke, the great Tao had already slightly vibrated and a white palm stretched out from it. With a gentle grab, it had already crushed the terrifying power of the heavenly cauldron that Luo Fan had condensed. This grab contained the mysteries of the sage Tao that even Luo Fan could not fully understand. In fact, it was not even one of the more than 30 trillion false sage theurgies that Luo Fan had obtained from the primordial sage. There was actually a hint of a real sage theurgy. True sage theurgy. Luo Fan was taken aback. He retreated and disappeared from the bottom of the bottle in the blink of an eye, appearing somewhere not far away from the bottom of the bottle. I didn't expect to be discovered by you. Originally, I thought that I would eventually merge with the great Tao formed by the many sage treasures and become a sage. I didn't expect so many sages to not discover me, but you, who is not even a sage, discovered me. A voice came into Luo Fan's ears. This voice was calm and indifferent, but it was the voice of a typical sage, or rather a false sage. Then a figure slowly walked out from the great Tao. It was a young man. He was 8 feet tall and had a calm expression. His eyes contained incomparably deep wisdom and indifference. Around him, there was an eternal and indestructible aura. It was the first time Luo Fan had seen such an aura in his life. Even the primordial sage seemed to be slightly inferior to him. In an instant, Luo Fan understood. This was a false sage. Moreover, his cultivation level might be even higher than the primordial sage, who was the first to become a sage in the world, and his power was even more unbelievable. When this false sage appeared, the great Tao behind him naturally shrank and attached to his back. It changed slightly, and in the blink of an eye, it could no longer be seen that it was originally a long strip. Instead, it seemed to have turned into a puff of smoke, and it also looked like circles of light. I'm Luo Fan. How should I address you? Luo Fan asked with a frown. You can call me Hunguzi. The sage glanced at Luo Fan indifferently. Tao. Upon hearing this, Luo Fan's heart skipped a beat. Usually, false sages would call themselves sages. This person who still maintained his Taoist name and mastered the sage's divine ability was very likely to be a kind of identity. With a thought, he asked, so it's fellow Taoist Hunguzi. May I know which sage you're a disciple of? Hunguzi looked at Luo Fan, and the indifference in his eyes suddenly disappeared. Then, a faint smile appeared on his face. Which saints are you referring to? Looking at his expression, Luo Fan knew. He had guessed correctly. This person was indeed a disciple of one of the 7 true sages, the Grand Supreme Tao Ancestor, the Primordial Lord of Heaven, the Grand Mist Ancestor, the Ancestor of all demons, Amitba, and Empress Hua. Fellow Taoist, why ask when you already know the answer? How could someone who possesses the true sage's divine ability and is willing to keep his Taoist name be a disciple of another false sage? Luo Fan sighed. Looks like I've met someone from the same hometown. That's right, my master. He's the venerable sage, the Grand Mist Ancestor, said Hunguzi. Ah, so you're a disciple of the Grand Mist Sage. Forgive me for my rudeness. I met Wu Weizi once before, but we didn't have a chance to talk, said Luo Fan with a salute. Hunguzi laughed. So you're a friend of junior sister Wu Weizi. No wonder you could recognize that I was using a true sage's divine ability. I was truly disrespectful earlier. Although they hadn't established a deep friendship after their conversation, they'd at least dispelled the enmity between them. With a casual swing of his axe, Luo Fan changed the appearance of the entire vast thousand domains. It was now an orbicular sky and square earth, presenting an extremely leisurely landscape. As for the bottom of the bottle, he put away. After losing the Tao fragment, the bottom of the bottle had long since turned into an ordinary artifact fragment. Although it still possessed some power, it was completely incomparable to before. With a single thought, Luo Fan took complete control of it and easily put it away. During this process, Hun Guzi didn't stop him. He just watched with interest. Although the entire transformation process seemed grand, it only took a thought for Luo Fan. In the end, it didn't even take him a moment to complete it. In the blink of an eye, the original appearance of the universe had changed into an extremely beautiful world with an orbicular sky and square earth. It's a little crude, please forgive me. Luo Fan smiled. This is the Cheeling Cliff, right? Are you Marshal Uncle Myriad Demon's junior brother? Hun Guzi asked with a smile. Hearing this, Luo Fan hurriedly shook his head. No, I don't have the honor of being a sage's disciple. It's just that I had a deep impression of the Cheeling Cliff when I first came here. That's why I set it up now. The orbicular sky and square earth in front of him were built by Luo Fan according to the Cheeling Cliff. Although there were some differences in the details, it completely recreated the style of the Cheeling Cliff. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Hun Guzi came to a realization and nodded. I see. Luo Fan invited Hun Guzi to the platform that was set up by the Sea of Clouds. After sitting down, he asked, May I ask if you're a sage's disciple? Why did you become a false sage in the outer realm? Hun Guzi laughed. It seems that I'm the first disciple of a sage that has become a false sage. Hearing this, Luo Fan's heart shook. The first? Doesn't that mean that there are many disciples of sages who have become false sages in these worlds? Although he thought that, he still bowed respectfully. Please enlighten me, fellow Taoist. Hun Guzi was already a false sage. Although the great Tao he was attached to was small, its essence was also the great Tao of the world that could give birth to sages. Therefore, he was attached to the great Tao, which meant that every place he was in that world, which also meant that he was. He could unleash the power of a false sage no matter where he was. Coupled with the numerous true saint divine abilities that he possessed, the strength that he could unleash was countless times more powerful than an ordinary false saint. In fact, he might even be much stronger than a false sage who possessed a pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasure. Under such circumstances, even though this was the interior of the divine court's heaven cauldron, even though Luo Fan could unleash unimaginably powerful power here, he didn't dare to say that he could easily subdue Hun Guzi. Just this alone was enough for Luo Fan to treat Hun Guzi kindly, to avoid conflict. Not to mention, Hun Guzi had a supreme, true sage like the ancestor of primordial chaos behind him. Although he didn't know how much more care he could receive from the true sage, even a little bit of care was enough for Luo Fan to treat him extremely politely. The closer he was to the Tao of the sage, he felt that the way of the sage was unfathomable. Even though he already possessed the pseudo-sage abilities and the power of a false sage, he knew very well that if he were to face a real sage, he definitely wouldn't be able to resist at all. If a real sage wanted to deal with him, he wouldn't even need to show up. He could easily crush him to the point of no return. Under such circumstances, as long as there was a slight chance that Hun Guzi would attract the ancestor of primordial chaos to attack him, he wouldn't dare to take the risk easily. It wasn't strange that a true sage could easily kill a false sage. A true sage was perfect and flawless without any flaws. They were eternal and indestructible without any weaknesses. As for a false sage, no matter how powerful they were, even if some of their power was comparable to a true sage, they were definitely imperfect and had flaws. Such imperfections. This kind of flaw was nothing to other false sages, but to a true sage, that was definitely a fatal flaw. If any true sage wanted to destroy a false sage, they only needed to use a true sage ability to slightly change the heaven and earth of the false sage. That would be enough to knock the false sage down and then easily wipe them out. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Hun Guzi chuckled and said, Haven't you ever wondered why there are so many supreme supremacies in the outer realm and level 9 false sages are like dogs? But in our world, level 2 or 3 false sages are enough to flaunt their prowess and become the strongest powerhouse in the world apart from the sages? Although this was an extremely obvious strange state, Luo Fan had never thought about it. Of course, it wasn't because he was stupid, but because these things didn't mean much to him, so he naturally couldn't be bothered to look into it. Now that he heard Han Guzi mention it, he suddenly understood and said, "Fellow Taoist, do you mean that the false sages in our world have already entered the outer realm to become false sages?" "That's right. In our world, there's a true sage suppressing it, so there's no room for one to become a false sage. If one wants to become a true sage, one can only become a true sage. However, how difficult is it to become a true sage? In billions of years, how many billions of geniuses have confidently tried to break through to the true sage realm, but ended up dying without a burial? After all, there are only a few who can truly think that they're stronger than all the geniuses in the past. However, most cultivators have self-awareness. They clearly know that they have no hope of becoming a true sage, so they set their goal on becoming a false sage long ago. After becoming a false sage, they naturally leave the world early and head to the outer realm to cultivate in order to become a false sage. For example, I'm like this." Hun Guzi laughed. Hearing this, Luo Fan was puzzled again. Then why has there never been a legend of the outer realm and a false sage in our world? Hun Guzi laughed and said, "You didn't become a false sage in the world back then, right?" Hearing this, Luo Fan understood and could not help but smile bitterly.